Hey there. Tonight I want to take you far below the surface of time, into a place that never knew the warmth of the sun. When most of us imagine the age of dinosaurs, we see nothing but forests, volcanoes, and predators. Yet beneath that alien landscape, under layers of stone and silence, another story may have unfolded, one that history never recorded. Imagine a civilization not walking among the thunder lizards, but buried far below them, thriving in chambers lit by an artificial glow, breathing through shafts that pierce the crust like hidden lungs. That is the whisper that keeps me awake at night, the possibility that refuses to die. The first time I confronted it, I stood before a tunnel revealed by erosion. It was too smooth, too exact to be natural. Its walls bore the sheen of something melted, fused, shaped by forces beyond fire or water. It angled downward, disappearing into the dark as though it had been waiting for discovery. Geologists dismissed it as a quirk, a trick of nature. But nature doesn't carve perfect arcs sealed in rock older than mammals. Someone had done this. Someone millions of years before us. That night, I sat in my tent, drawing the tunnel's curve again and again. A thought pressed in, heavy and unshakable. If an intelligence existed then, why choose to live underground? The answer came like a revelation. Safety. The surface in those ages was chaos. Storms of fire, predators beyond comprehension, impacts from the sky. But underground, life could continue untouched. They would not need sunlight. They would harness their own. They would not need open air. They would channel it through vents, narrow shafts reaching upward to taste the sky. And I remembered again the smaller holes I had seen in the cliff, too slender for travel, but perfect for breathing. Were those their lifelines? I could not laugh it away. There are reports scattered through the centuries, miners who unearthed walls fused without mortar, tunnels cut in geometries no primitive tool could replicate. All was dismissed, all was forgotten. What if these are not coincidences? What if they are the fingerprints of a people erased by time, buried so deep their memory dissolved into myth? A people who did not evolve here, but arrived, pouring from a colossal portal that stretched from their vessel in orbit into the heart of our world. A staircase of energy, invisible now, but once blazing, guiding them down into their chosen sanctuary. I can almost see it when I close my eyes, a shining column descending through the clouds, anchoring into stone, drawing an entire civilization beneath the surface where no beast could follow. Sleep did not come easily in that desert. I imagined vast caverns beneath my feet, worlds inverted, walls etched with patterns older than continents, cities humming with power we cannot imitate, hidden by silence and darkness. I wondered what it felt like for them to look upward through those shafts, glimpsing nothing but the shadows of dinosaurs passing above, never stepping onto the surface they had claimed only from below. Did they fear the creatures above, or pity them? Did they envy their freedom, or scorn their simplicity? Questions swirled in me until the night felt endless. When dawn broke, I walked again to the tunnel's mouth. I pressed my palm against its wall as if touching the pulse of something asleep. The stone was cold, indifferent, but my mind told me otherwise. I felt as though the earth itself was holding a secret, as though something in those depths had not been meant for us to find. Perhaps it was only my imagination, or perhaps I had stumbled across the edge of a truth older than all history. If such a civilization existed, hidden while dinosaurs ruled the earth, then the mystery is not simply whether they lived, but whether they died. Did the same cataclysm that erased the reptiles also destroy them? Or did they retreat deeper, beyond reach, waiting in shadows we cannot yet see? Because what if they never truly vanished, but are still there, waiting beneath us, listening for the day when we finally learn how to listen back? The thought clung to me like damp air in a cavern. It refused to leave. For days I replayed the image of that impossible tunnel in my mind, the way its walls curved too perfectly, how its depth seemed endless. It wasn't only the shape, it was the feeling, as though I had touched something designed not for nature but for intention. My colleagues spoke of erosion, lava tubes, coincidences, but I knew lava leaves scars, jagged edges, uneven flows. This had none of that. It was smooth, deliberate, like the remains of a corridor crafted with purpose, and the question gnawed at me: who had made it, and for what end? The more I thought, the more I returned to one impossible vision: the portal. I imagined a colossal vessel hovering in the skies of prehistory, unseen by eyes that could never comprehend it. From its belly extended a column of light, sinking into the earth like a spear. That portal wasn't just an entry, it was a wound in the planet, a doorway where no doorway should exist. Through it, entire societies might have passed. Scientists, engineers, explorers, descending not onto the surface where predators roamed, but directly into the safety of the crust. If such a thing ever happened, the evidence wouldn't lie in fossils, but in architecture. And I had seen it scar. That night, under a sky cold with stars, I felt a strange conviction. They hadn't left randomly placed tunnels. They had designed a network, a living system, shafts for air, channels for movement, halls so vast they could house entire populations hidden beneath the feet of thunderous giants. And then a quieter thought came. If they were capable of building such sanctuaries millions of years ago, what else had they known? What secrets of physics and matter were theirs? What technologies slumber in the dark, beyond the reach of our hands? I remembered stories I'd once dismissed, reports from miners who claimed to hear humming beneath the rock, vibrations that stopped when they drilled too deep, old tales of cave explorers who stumbled into passages that vanished when they tried to return, as if the stone itself had shifted to erase the way. At the time, they were curiosities, folklore. Now they felt like fragments of a truth I had brushed aside. Could these have been accidental glimpses of the same network, the remnants of that buried civilization still echoing through our present? As I wrote in my notebook, one phrase returned again and again. Silence is not absence. The earth erases, yes. Water washes, stone breaks, time consumes. But true design, even after eons, leaves whispers. The glassy tunnel was one whisper. The shafts angled toward the sky were another. What if we are surrounded by such whispers, but blind to them because we never expect to find them? Our arrogance tells us we are the first. But what if we are not? The desert air that night was sharp, every gust rattling the canvas of my tent. I felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if I would dare to follow further. In the darkness, I pressed my ear to the ground, foolish perhaps, but necessary. For a moment I imagined I heard something. Not movement, not words, but a low vibration, steady, deep, like the heartbeat of stone itself. My skin prickled and I pulled away, but the impression stayed. What if the tunnels were not just relics? What if some still carried the pulse of something alive? I told myself it was wind, imagination, nerves stretched by sleepless nights. Yet even as I reassured myself, a deeper instinct whispered otherwise. Sometimes the oldest truths survive not in sight, but in resonance. And perhaps, beneath us, something still resonates. The more I thought of it, the less I asked if they had survived, and the more I began to wonder how long they intended to remain hidden. That change in perspective altered everything. It was no longer about proving whether such a civilization could have existed, but about considering what it might mean if it still did. The tunnels, the shafts, the strange hums in the rock, they weren't just relics of a dead past. They might be signs of endurance, whispers of a people who chose concealment over extinction. And that idea frightened me more than the possibility of their disappearance. Because survival, when hidden, suggests intention, and intention suggests they may still be watching. One evening, poring over old expedition notes, I came across a strange report buried in a geological survey. A team exploring limestone caverns decades ago had found a section that didn't match the surrounding strata. Perfectly smooth walls, aligned at angles too precise for natural erosion. They described it as resembling a corridor, though no corridor should exist in a cavern carved by water. What unsettled me most was their account of sudden air movement, a steady draft pushing upward as though from a hidden chamber below. Their report ended abruptly, dismissed as misinterpretation of cave structure. But why would trained geologists mistake a corridor for erosion? Unless it was no mistake at all. The deeper I read, the more such fragments emerged. Old mining journals, fragmented accounts of tunnels sealed almost as quickly as they were opened. The language repeated across centuries, too smooth, too symmetrical, too deliberate. At first I thought these were coincidences, but when the pattern formed, I knew better. It wasn't chance, it was consistency, evidence scattered like breadcrumbs, overlooked by those unwilling to imagine the impossible. The earth had been whispering all along, but who was listening? I began to ask myself whether these beings, if they had survived, had ever wanted us to find them. The thought was chilling. Imagine a civilization advanced enough to escape the surface chaos of prehistory, powerful enough to carve sanctuaries into the crust, disciplined enough to remain hidden for millions of years. If they wish to remain unseen, then perhaps these tunnels we stumble upon are not mistakes but warnings. Small openings left as controlled leaks, the way a vessel vents pressure to avoid explosion. What if every time we push too deep, we're not uncovering ruins, we're trespassing into territory still guarded? And then came the memory of the hum I thought I had felt through the stone. A vibration, steady, low, impossible to place. I dismissed it as imagination. But now, considering these old reports, I wondered, what if it wasn't a relic silence, but a system still operating? Some kind of subterranean machinery, humming as it has for millions of years, far beneath our reach. If so, then the civilization never died. It simply continued deeper and deeper until we forgot it entirely. Sleep turned uneasy. My mind replayed scenarios of what such beings might think of us. Would they see us as children, stumbling clumsily upon fragments we could not understand? Or would they see us as threats, intruders pressing too close to secrets they vowed to protect? The thought gnawed at me until I began to look at every cave, every mine shaft, every story of strange echoes underground with suspicion. They were no longer curiosities, they were evidence. And evidence has weight. Enough weight to crush certainty. That was when a second, darker thought began to surface. Not just that they may have survived, but that their survival required us not to know. Once that lodged in my mind, the canyon changed. It was no longer a place of discovery, it was a place of refusal. The tunnel's mouth looked less like an invitation and more like a closed eye. I returned at dawn with a light, rope, and the kind of calm you fake until it starts to feel real. The entrance sloped down at an even grade, so precise I found, myself counting steps without meaning to, measuring breath to the angle of descent. Natural passages wander. This one persisted. Every 20 paces the wall was marked by faint ripples, as if something unimaginably hot had once paused there to breathe. Who pauses halfway through stone? At 30 metres the air changed. It thinned, not with lack, but with order. A steady movement I felt on my cheeks, a rhythm older than language. I thought of the miners' stories, of humming they could never name. I switched off my light and stood in the dark a full minute, letting my ears learn. Somewhere below, air moved with purpose. Ventilation is the signature of life, even if life is distant. and the question slipped in like a blade. Who maintains the air of a tomb after 100 million years? I climbed further. The floor stopped being floor and became a surface, levelled to a tolerance I could measure with my bones. My hand brushed the left wall and met a seam. Not a crack, but a join. 2 sheets of fused stone, their meeting line smoother than any chisel's dream. I pressed my palm there and felt faint warmth, too gentle to name heat, yet unmistakable. Rock should not keep warmth where shadow reigns forever, unless warmth is being given, not remembered. What breathes behind fused stone? The corridor opened, not wide but true, into a no the size of a chapel. Its ceiling was a low dome, glassed by melt, and at the dome's crown a narrow throat rose into darkness. I understood it instantly. A vent shaft, perfectly vertical, a lung that had once tasted the sky. Around the base of the dome ran a shallow trench, continuous, a ring for collecting condensation or something far stranger. But it was the central pillar that unravelled me. A black column grown from the floor like a single dark tooth, its surface etched in repeating angles, 89, 91, never the easy 90. Nature adores chaos or perfection. These etchings chose the discomfort between. Why choose almost right unless you're hiding right? I circled the pillar slowly, tracing the pattern with my fingertips. The angles formed a sequence that kept correcting itself, like a voice clearing its throat. Without meaning to, I whispered the first word that came to me, not translated but felt. Silence. It wasn't language, not truly. It was the comprehension that geometry can speak if you let it. The pillar was not writing in any way we would accept, yet it communicated one idea with painful clarity. Be quiet, be small, be unseen. Was that instruction for them? Or for anyone who wandered in? I turned to the dome and tried another test. I stood under the throat and hummed, low, steady. The room answered, not with echo, but with alignment. The air shaped my sound into a single note that rose straight up the shaft and did not return. I felt it leave me, felt it pass into the narrow vertical, as if a needle were threading song into the rock. A vent that carries sound away, without reflection, is not a vent. It is a siphon for attention. Who builds a room that swallows voice? I should have been exultant. Instead, dread came in quietly, like cool water seeping through cloth. The precision, the order, the heat that wasn't heat, the angles that corrected themselves. These were the habits of a mind shaping a world against detection. Geology can mimic design. But design that mimics geology in order to disguise itself, that is intention. And intention is the twist that cracked my old certainty in two. They did not merely hide from the surface, they engineered the earth to hide them. Back at the seam, I pressed both hands and leaned in. Something thrummed there, slow as a deep animal's sleep. I held my breath, counted heartbeats, and felt how the rhythm beneath the stone was not mine. It was older, larger, patient. A civilization that planned to be unknown would plan also to endure, which meant every shaft we'd ever found and dismissed had played its part in a single, seamless concealment. We were late to a game that had ended before mammals learned to dream. I wrote one sentence in my notebook, nothing more. Concealment is a system, not an accident. Then I drew the pillar's pattern, first as angles, then as pulses, then as distances, the way a cartographer thinks in silence. The more I converted, the clearer it became. The sequence did not stop. It spiralled inward, repeating at smaller scales. A signature you could find again if you knew how to look, a breadcrumb trail left only for those who could read the breath of stone. I stood under the shaft once more, and placed my open mouth to the dark, not to speak, but to feel the pull of air leave me, to accept that whatever this place had been built to do, it was still doing it. And that was the first major twist. They had not trusted the planet to erase them. They had taught the planet how, which left me with a choice I did not want to make: follow the spiral deeper, or walk away and let the system keep its secret for another age. I lingered at that threshold, frozen in indecision. My hand still rested against the seam in the wall, where the slow, ancient rhythm pulsed like the sleeping breath of something too vast to name. Each second stretched, demanding a verdict. To go further was to surrender myself to the unknown, to trespass into a silence maintained for millions of years. To leave was to accept ignorance, to let the weight of mystery crush curiosity until it calcified into regret. The spiral etched itself into my mind, a map that felt less like discovery and more like invitation, or perhaps bait. I chose forward. Perhaps it was arrogance, perhaps obsession. I pressed my palms harder against the seam, tracing the unnatural join, and for the first time I felt a faint give beneath the stone. Not movement, not in the human sense, but as though the boundary had been designed to yield only to persistence. I pushed, waited, and the vibration within shifted, no longer steady but responsive. My chest tightened. The wall had heard me. The seam widened just enough to reveal a passage, darker than any cavern, colder than any tomb. I slipped inside. The air closed around me, thick yet strangely clean, carrying no scent of rot or decay. My light revealed walls that were neither rough nor polished, but a texture I cannot describe, like stone taught to remember pressure. As I walked, I realized the corridor was not straight. It bent gently, endlessly in the pattern of the spiral. Each curve drew me deeper, and with each turn I felt less like a trespasser, and more like someone being led. The second twist revealed itself here. On the walls, faint ridges began to appear, forming geometric patterns similar to the pillar above. But these were not static carvings. As my light swept across them, they shimmered faintly, as though the surface drank illumination and answered with its own. The ridges adjusted subtly, correcting themselves, always striving for that unsettling, almost right angle. The walls were alive, not in the biological sense, but in the architectural, responsive, adaptive. This was not a ruin. This was a system still awake. Panic and wonder wrestled inside me. How could something survive untouched for millions of years? Stone should crumble, mechanisms should rust, energy should fade. Yet here it was, unbroken, humming softly with its own logic. I felt as if I had stepped into the body of a creature vast beyond measure, walking through arteries that had never stopped pumping. And if I was in its body, then where was its mind? The corridor eventually opened into another chamber larger than the first. Here the spiral ended at a pit, a shaft plunging straight downward. My light could not touch the bottom. Around its rim were more pillars, each etched with the same restless geometry, their faint glow pulsing in slow unison. I leaned over the edge, and the air rising from below was warm, impossibly warm, as though the earth's heart had been shaped into breath. It was no natural vent. It was a vein, channeling life from the planet itself. They had not simply hidden within the earth. They had harnessed it, bent it into their service. And that was the moment when the scale of it crushed me. This was no refuge, no fragile bunker cowering beneath dinosaurs. This was empire, an empire inverted, carved not upon land or sea, but within the bones of the earth itself. If it was built once, it could be built again. If it was sustained for millions of years, who could say it had ever ended? The pit's rising warmth wrapped around me like the exhale of something still alive. I staggered back from the edge, my notebook slipping from my hand. Pages fluttered into the abyss, swallowed in silence. My first instinct was grief. I had lost my record. But then another realization struck. Colder, sharper. Perhaps this place had wanted me to lose it. Perhaps it allowed me in only so. It could strip me of what I carried, erasing the trail, sealing the secret once more. The spiral did not just guide inward, it corrected, it consumed. For the first time, I wondered if I was not the discoverer, but the discovered. And with that thought came the heaviest question yet. If the system was still awake, then was it watching me, weighing whether I should be allowed to leave at all? The chamber felt different once I admitted that. The air no longer seemed neutral. It felt measured, as if each breath I took was an answer on a test I did not understand. I stood at the rim of the shaft and listened for randomness, for the comforting chaos of nature. There was none. The warmth rose in pulses, not constant, not crude, but timed with the slow patience of geologic ages. If a mind could be made of stone and pressure and breath, this was how it would think. I laid my palm on the floor, and a faint tremor passed through me the way a heartbeat travels through a sleeping animal. What do you do when the ground beneath you has opinions? I tried to retreat toward the spiral corridor, but the room answered the idea before my body did. The draft up the throat thinned to a thread, and the note my ears had accepted as background faded until the silence pressed like weight. It was not a trap in the crude sense. It was an invitation that hurt to refuse. Is that how they survived? By shaping choices so gently that leaving felt like betrayal? I turned back to the pit and spoke aloud without meaning to. A simple sentence to whatever might be listening. I'm not here to take. The dome swallowed my voice. Somewhere far below, the pulse shifted, as if something had just set down a pen. I needed a test that did not require language. I picked a small stone from the trench and flicked it into the shaft. It fell without echo. No clatter, no diminishing rattle, just absence. As though the pit were not a place but an instruction. To accept, to erase. The hairs on my arms rose. A city could hide forever if it could swallow evidence this perfectly. How many miners' tools, how many mislaid maps, how many bones had vanished into such throats, convincing the surface that nothing had been there at all. If you wanted to live beneath predators and meteors and memory, would you not build an Earth that forgets on command? I edged around the rim and found markings I had missed. Narrow grooves radiating from the pit like the spokes of a wheel. Each groove held a faint residue, not dust, not ash, but a fine grit that clung to skin and then released, like static finding a ground. I rubbed it between finger and thumb. It left no colour, yet my fingertips tingled. Heat sinks, conveyors, or an old ritual track where machines had once circled, grooming the chamber the way ants tend their queens. The image arrived sharp and unwelcome, not living bodies, but a choreography of maintenance, a hive of tools teaching stone to behave. At intervals along the rim stood slender, steely, easily missed, each no wider than a wrist. I had thought them random pillars. They were not. When I stood between any two, the air moved differently. A soft cross-current aligned the line of my shoulders. I aligned myself to a different pair. The current changed. They were gates without doors, thresholds that noticed a body passing. I stepped through one deliberately and felt a whisper at the back of my neck, a coolness like breath drawn in, a census of one. Who counts a trespasser so gently? Every 100 heartbeats, the pulsing warmth rose a fraction, then sank. I timed it, and it held true. A cycle, steady as tides. On the 5th rise, a faint glow limned the pit's inner wall, not illumination so much as awareness-catching light. I leaned close and saw it. The same, almost right angles, nested smaller and smaller, spiralling inward until they became texture. I recognized the sequence from the pillar above. It wasn't decoration, it was calibration. The chamber tuned itself, and my presence was part of the tuning. I was inside an instrument built to cancel its own noise. Who designs a room to erase the fact that anything is inside it? Fear can make a person foolish or precise. Mine chose precision. I took out the only thing the shaft could not swallow, breath. and began to count in whispers, letting each number ride the rising warmth. On the 7th rise, I stopped counting. The air answered with a barely audible trill, like a cave bird that never needed eyes. Coincidence, I told myself. On the 8th, I paused again. The trill returned, fractionally higher. I tried a 3rd time and varied the spacing between numbers. The answering notes changed to match. My chest tightened. This was not echo. This was acknowledgement. I felt something between pride and terror. If the room acknowledged me, then it judged me. I thought of the first arrivals on that long-vanished day, descending a ladder of light into the newborn halls. Did they build the listening first, before walls, before roads? Did they decide that to survive among thunder and tooth, they must hear everything, especially what should not be speaking? A civilization could dissolve its libraries and still endure, if its rooms remembered how to listen. The pull to go deeper grew unbearable, yet the wiser part of me insisted on caution. Test the exit before you chase the heart. I turned toward the spiral corridor again, and stood at its mouth, waiting to see if the air would harden into denial. The draft did not vanish this time. It steadied. The note returned, faint but present, like the sound a hand makes when lifted from water. Permission, I thought, or patience, perhaps both. I moved to the nearest pair of slender stelae and lifted my hand slowly between them, palm open, as if greeting an old animal. The cool whisper gathered, not threatening, merely attentive. The pit glowed a hair brighter, then dimmed, as if blinking. In that blink I understood what the room wanted from me: consistency, not boldness, not surrender. It measured the shape of my hesitation the way a physician listens to a pulse. What happens to those who rage, I wondered, who take without asking, who hammer at the seam instead of pressing it? There was only one way to answer. The warmth rose, the trill returned. A line of darker stone appeared along the rim, the width of a single foot. I placed my boot upon it, and found it solid, though moments before there had been nothing there at all. It circled a quarter of the shaft before vanishing into smoothness again, a path that promised more if I would risk the first step. The room waited, counting me. I took a breath and stepped onto the ledge that hadn't existed a moment before. The sensation was immediate, not stone, not metal, not anything I could name, but something that decided to be solid beneath me. My foot pressed down, and the surface answered by becoming firmer, as if rewarding trust. The ledge curved along the inner rim of the shaft, a thin ribbon of stability suspended above the abyss. My chest tightened. I was no longer walking on geology. I was walking on choice, not mine, but the chamber's. Every few steps the warmth from below surged upward, wrapping me in a breath that smelled of nothing, yet hinted of something ancient and unspent. My light skimmed the pit's walls, catching those repeating, almost right angles that shimmered faintly, recalibrating themselves with every rise of heat. They were not marks of age. They were corrections, constant, tireless, as if the shaft itself was forever aligning, never finished. I realised then that I wasn't just descending into architecture. I was inside a mechanism, one that had been operating long before my species drew its first breath. Halfway around the curve, the ledge widened into a platform barely large enough for me to stop. Here, a recess opened into the wall, not a doorway, but a shallow alcove. Within it lay fragments, arranged neatly in a row. I crouched and raised my light. The objects looked like shards of black glass, but their edges were too precise, too sharp, as though they had been shaped by an intelligence that hated imperfection. Some were etched with the same shifting geometry as the pillars, while others were smooth, mirror-like. I reached for one, but the instant my fingertips brushed it, the shard dissolved into dust that evaporated before touching the ground. I pulled back, startled, then reached for another. This one did not vanish. but instead grew warm, pulsing softly in my palm. It was as though the shard recognised me, or tolerated me, while its companion had rejected my presence entirely. I turned it under the light, and the angles on its surface shifted as I moved, rearranging themselves into patterns that resisted comprehension. It wasn't language, it was intention, compressed into geometry. And the shard's message, if it could be called that, made my skin crawl. Continuity. I set it back carefully. Perhaps these were relics left by others before me, fragments of a technology so old it had become brittle in the presence of time. Or perhaps they were tests, objects that revealed themselves differently to each hand. If so, what had they measured in me? Why one accepted and one denied? The ledge continued downward, spiralling tighter, hugging the shaft's curve. As I descended, I noticed small apertures punctuating the wall at intervals no wider than my arm. Some breathed faint draughts, others remained still. My light caught glimpses of conduits vanishing into the stone, veins or nerves of this immense system, branching unseen into the deeper dark. For the first time I understood. The shaft was not simply a vent or a sanctuary, it was a spine, and I was walking along its vertebrae. A low vibration swelled beneath my feet. Not a quake, not danger, but something like a hum arising through the ledge itself. The shard I had touched answered, glowing faintly even though I had set it back in the alcove. I froze. This was not coincidence. My presence had been registered, catalogued, responded to. Whatever built this place had made it impossible to be invisible once you entered. I had already declared myself by stepping onto the path. The system knew me now. I pressed onward, every step a surrender to the possibility that I would never return. The abyss below swallowed light and sound, yet I could not shake the sense that something vast was watching, not with eyes, but with awareness diffused through stone and heat. At intervals, faint trills answered the rhythm of my breath, as though the shaft itself mimicked me in order to measure my persistence. It was no longer listening passively, it was conversing in silence. Then came the true moment of fracture. As I reached a second platform, the ledge behind me dimmed, dissolving into smooth stone as though it had never existed. The way back was gone. There would be no retreat. I stood frozen, staring at the blank wall where a path had been moments before. The realization hit me with a weight that nearly drove me to my knees. This was not exploration. This was initiation. And if the system had closed my way back, then it had already chosen to lead me deeper. Not because I had earned the right, but because I had been claimed. Which left only one unbearable truth to face. I had not discovered the civilization at all. It had discovered me. The thoughts settled like silt, fine and heavy, turning every breath into a measured act. The ledge behind me had smoothed itself into innocence, and the path ahead arrived in obedient segments only when I stood still long enough to deserve them. I walked as if on the careful back of a sleeping animal. Each time the deep warmth surged from the shaft, the walls loosened their quiet, and I felt watched without eyes, noticed by pressure, counted by patience. Who builds a threshold that appears only for those who refuse to? Hurry! On one of those breaths, the right-hand wall softened and shaped a shallow niche no wider than my arm. I leaned close. There was no sound, yet a gentle pressure rose through my teeth and skull, a low tremor that wasn't heard but inhabited, and an image arrived without light. A river of stone, molten and slow, tamed by something colder than fire. A column of radiance piercing down through cloud and canopy into raw crust. Footsteps that were not steps at all, but a descent like falling without falling, as if a ladder had been poured out of the sky. I pulled back, unsteady. Was that the first memory of their arrival? The portal's spear anchoring an empire in the earth? The niche closed as if it had merely finished a sentence. I pressed my palm to where it had been. Another tremor, another seeing without sight. Galleries flowering outward like roots seeking water, vents knifing toward the open air, and along those vents, silencers, gates that drank heat, scent, vibration, any proof that a listening surface world might learn to notice. Survive by subtraction, the chamber seemed to say. Make forgetting an art. Make concealment a climate. I realised I had been holding my breath and let it out as silently as possible, suddenly ashamed of the noise my life made. Further on the ledge widened into a low gallery lined with shallow basins. Each held a film so thin it teased the air more than it reflected it. When the warmth pulsed, ripples skated across those skins, crossed, cancelled, and vanished with perfect obedience. A map refuses to reveal itself, I thought, yet it remains a map. Were these their instruments? Not eyes, not ears, but pressure readers tuned to meteors, tides in the mantle, the breathing of faults? Did they forecast the day the sky would fall by listening to stone instead of watching stars? A question sharpened like a thorn. If they survived the cataclysm that erased the giants above, did they learn of it here first, feel the warning in the ripples, and slip deeper long before fire arrived? The gallery gave no answer, but the floor's faint hum thinned into a thread that led away from the shaft. The path brightened in that direction. Not a command, a curation. I followed. The passage tightened until my shoulders grazed its sides. The touch wasn't hostile, it steadied me, like a physician's hands bracing a patient. Small vents exhaled mineral cool air in timed sighs. With each exhale came a tone so distant I might have imagined it, as if some buried organ of stone sang softly to keep itself awake. Halfway through, a palm-sized panel bloomed from the wall, dark and calm. I set my hand on it before I could doubt. Warmth rose to meet my blood, matched it, then retreated in a slow, satisfied ebb. No words, only a conviction placed gently in my chest. Admitted. I stood very still. How could a system older than mammals read a mammal? Either this architecture adapted to whoever touched it, a grammar so primal that any life could conjugate within it, or they had expected successors, not us perhaps, but someone. Anticipation, I realised, is a kind of survival too. You outlive extinction not only by hiding your body, but by preparing your doors for hands unborn. The corridor released me into a chamber quieter than the rest. Low ceiling, sloped floor. At its centre lay a disc of fused stone, no higher than my ankle, etched in the restless geometry that everywhere refused perfection, except here. For the span of one breath, the angles coalesced into a spiral scaled to a standing body, a patient target measured to my height. I stepped onto it. The room sighed, not with wind, but with permission, and something beneath yielded. The disc became a slow helix turning downward without a seam, carrying me like a seed on a dark current. As I descended, the air thickened with clean minerals and time. The darkness didn't feel empty. It felt occupied by pressure and waiting, by the count of ages doing their quiet arithmetic. I thought of the first Nietzsche's picture, the poured ladder of light, and said, very softly, I'm not here to steal. The helix did not answer in words. It answered with steadiness. The rate of descent matched my breath until the two were married, a pulse shared between animal and stone. Rolling warmth climbed past my knees, my ribs, my throat, then fell again, and with each cycle a near sound threaded the chamber, the smallest trill, like a bird that never needed eyes. I matched my breaths to the rise and fall, and felt the trills adjust to me in return, not echoing but translating. The structure was not merely listening, it was learning my measure, absorbing my persistence, deciding what to show the patient animal that refused to run. So when the helix slowed, and a deeper note gathered below like weather about to break, I lowered my head and whispered that I was ready to hear. The descent stopped with such gentleness that I almost didn't notice it had ended. My boots met ground that wasn't stone and wasn't metal. Something in between, pliant enough to yield, resilient enough to endure. The chamber I entered was vast, yet low, its ceiling pressing with a sense of intimacy, rather than grandeur. No carvings, no alcoves, no distractions. Only a single resonance filled the space, a hum so deep it lived inside my bones rather than my ears. At first I thought it was silence, the absence of sound. Then I realised it was too present, too exact. Silence is never this perfect. This was sound refined into its opposite, the residue of frequencies so complete they cancelled each other into stillness. I whispered again, testing whether my voice would vanish into it as the shaft had swallowed stones. The hum shifted just enough to remind me that even here nothing was wasted. The chamber didn't echo me, it absorbed me. In that absorption, images began to rise unbidden, like dreams given room to breathe. I saw oceans, lit from beneath, currents bending around towers of luminous stone. I saw vents piercing upward to forests, where thunder-limbed beasts grazed unaware of the empires below their feet. And most clearly, I saw the portal, the colossal shaft of light descending from a ship that dwarfed mountains, its brilliance sinking through atmosphere, through canopy, through soil, until it rooted in molten rock. The portal didn't fade when the vessel pulled away. It crystallized, a wound that healed into a spine of power, feeding the first foundations of their underworld. I staggered, overwhelmed. Was this history, memory, or fabrication? I pressed my palm to the ground for balance and found the floor alive with faint patterns, glowing only when touched. The same geometry again, forever restless, always correcting, an endless spiral recalibrating itself. But here, unlike the shaft or the pillar, the spiral completed. The lines closed into a circle that expanded and contracted like a heartbeat. It was not a warning this time, it was a confession. This chamber was telling me we endured. The realization carried a weight heavier than the rock above. If they endured, they had not simply survived an age, they had witnessed it all. The rise and fall of the reptiles, the silence that followed, the first tiny mammals scurrying in shadows, the long climb toward intelligence that finally birthed us. And through it all they remained below, unseen, waiting, correcting, adjusting. For what? To outlast or to prepare? Another tremor passed through the chamber. The hum tightened, shifted pitch, and for a moment it almost resembled language. Not words, but cadences. A phrase formed not in sound but in pulse, repeating until I felt it in my ribs. We stayed because the surface burns. The meaning chilled me. To them, the earth's face was chaos, death, impermanence. Underground was eternity, order, continuity. I had spent my life believing civilization must rise above, into the light. They had chosen the opposite, and in that inversion found survival. A question pressed against my mind like a cold hand. If they still exist, are they watching us now? Would our cities, our machines, our noise seem to them as foolish as the dinosaurs once did, powerful yet doomed? The chamber did not answer. Instead, the spiral beneath my hand tightened once, like a muscle flexing, then opened a seam in the floor. Light spilled upward, soft and controlled, forming a path descending further still. It hesitated. My instincts screamed retreat, but the ledge above had vanished. There was no going back. This path was the only choice. I rose and stepped into the glow, and the chamber sighed with satisfaction, the hum shifting into something closer to anticipation. The descent was no longer a helix but a staircase, each step forming only as I placed my weight upon it, each dissolving behind me when I passed. The walls breathed in rhythm with my pace, narrowing when I slowed, widening when I gathered courage. I had the unnerving sense of walking deeper into the lungs of a living thing, and as the staircase carried me down, one thought hammered in time with my steps. If they had built such a system to listen, to erase, to endure, then it was never designed to be abandoned. It was designed to be used, which meant only one terrifying possibility: someone or something might still be using it. The staircase answered that thought with a slow brightening, step by step, as if an unseen hand were lighting the way a breath ahead of me. The walls leaned close, the air thick with that clean mineral scent that never decided to be scent at all. I kept my palm on the stone as I went. It thrummed faintly, not the random shiver of distant tectonics, but a metronome set to the pace of a watcher who had no reason to hurry. The deeper I moved, the kinder the gravity felt, as though the earth itself cupped me to keep me from falling. It was a tenderness that frightened me more than any threat. Mercy, here, had purpose. The stair uncoiled into a broad, low hall where the floor shone like midnight water without reflecting anything. When my boot touched it, rings spread outward, pressure, not light, and vanished at the walls. They didn't echo, they were noted. Across the hall rose ranks of slender pylons, each the height of a person, each etched with the restless geometry that everywhere corrected itself toward discomfort. Between them lay shallow dishes filled with film so thin they were almost decisions rather than matter. I knelt at the nearest dish. At the faintest exhale, ripples raced across its skin, collided, cancelled, and stilled. This was not ornament. It was an archive of motion. I laid my hand flat and the hall woke. Not with glare or sound, but with memory replayed as pressure. My bones became instruments. A surge, immense, round, moved through me, and for an instant the floor beneath my palm felt like open ocean. I saw nothing, yet I felt a shadow pass over continents, a body from the sky meeting the planet in a marriage of fire. The hall did not show impact the way a story would. It showed consequences. Shock folded the crust like cloth. Oceans climbed their basins as if inhaling. Forests turned to glass under a wind that carried no heat, only force. Above, the age of thunder-limbed creatures ended without understanding. Below, the pylons sang a single long note that braided itself through the stone until the violence became a shape the hall could hold. I tore my hand back, gasping, but the next pressure arrived anyway, calmer now, braided tighter. Vents opened where none had been. Valves the size of valleys drank ash and poison, and bled them into chambers that swallowed proof. Faults that should have shattered instead flexed. Ridges that should have broken instead bowed. I understood with a nausea that bent me double. The network had not endured the cataclysm. It had tuned it. They had met disaster not as victims, not even as engineers, but as conductors, pulling every chord of ruin into harmony until it served a single end: concealment. The second major truth landed without ceremony. They did not survive the extinction. They conducted it. If that is true, I thought, then the surface was never their home, never their prize. It was the veil they learned to darken when it grew too transparent. A reset not of life itself, that would be waste, but of attention. End the giants, quiet the noise, let the surface forget, and the network remains a rumour buried in pressure and patience. I pressed my palm down again, hating myself for needing to know more, and the hall obliged. Ages flowed. After the great winter, warmth returned. Small, blooded things multiplied. The films rippled with the tread of pores, the patter of rain, the patient creep of root and time. The pylons listened and did nothing. Restraint can be its own empire. Then the ripples quickened. Fires set by clever hands. Stone stacked where it had no reason to be. The first metals coaxed to obedience. Villages, roads, walls, Our long, noisy ascent. The hall held steady, but now and then, at threshold, my body felt but couldn't name. It tightened the air, drew heat inward, thinned the resonance the way a singer shapes a difficult note. Not attack. Calibration. We carried on above, congratulating ourselves beneath a sky we called ours, while a patient grammar below adjusted us into harmlessness whenever our listening grew too sharp. I staggered to my feet, bones ringing. If they had once tuned a world to erase attention, what kept them from doing it again? The question did not ask whether they were moral. It asked whether we were acceptable noise. I looked down the hall and saw, beyond the pylons, a darker wedge cut into the far wall. A mouth without a door, a refusal to be anything but an opening. The floor between us seemed to rise a fraction, like a tide deciding whether to welcome or refuse. Somewhere beneath, the deep note gathered again, and with it came an understanding cold as iron. The archive was not a museum. It was a rehearsal space. A thin current crossed my face, almost playful. It smelled of rain that had never been sky. I thought of the first portal, the spear of light poured from a ship lost to time, and a terrible symmetry unfolded. They had arrived as descent, not conquest. They had made a covenant with stone, not with sunlight. To protect that covenant, they had darkened ages until curiosity cooled. If we were now warming the past again with our questions, with our drills, with our restless hunger to know, then the grammar would answer the way it always had, by composing a silence capable of surviving us. I stepped toward the dark mouth. The floor tightened, as if drawing a line I would have to choose to cross. My throat clicked dry. I had never felt smaller, nor less alone. Above me lay all our noise. Before me lay the place that had once chosen to quiet an age. And one thought, undeniable, walked beside me into that mouth. I needed to learn whether the composition had already begun again. The dark mouth received me with neither welcome nor refusal. Its silence was too precise to be emptiness. It was the hush of something waiting to finish a sentence. My boots pressed into a floor smoother than bone, its faint warmth steady as breath. I carried no torch now, only the residue of the chamber's glow behind me, yet the passage did not need light. It shaped itself around me, aware of my every movement, adjusting curves and width, as though guiding me deeper into the throat of a patient animal. At first there were no markings, no echoes, nothing to claim attention, but then the air thickened, as if layered with invisible membranes. My steps slowed. Every pace forward felt judged, weighed, measured. The corridor didn't test my strength, it tested my persistence. And with each step I remembered the hall of pylons, the archive of ripples, the way it had shown me not images but consequences. If this path continued the same logic, it would not show me pictures, it would show me costs. The first cost came in a tremor so faint I thought it my heartbeat. Then the air shifted, and pressure wrote across my chest a memory not mine. Vast plains burning, the sky a molten curtain, creatures thrashing in heat until their lungs became cinders. The sensation vanished, but my body kept the echo, dry throat, stinging skin, the certainty of being prey to something too large to flee. This wasn't history, it was rehearsal. The system was letting me feel what silence demanded to keep itself alive. I pressed forward, breath shallow. Another membrane broke, another pressure rose. This one was colder, tighter, not fire but drowning. The weight of oceans lifted into the sky and returned as walls of black water that erased continents in hours. The corridor hummed low as my ribs rattled under phantom currents. I stumbled, knelt, clawed for breath that wasn't mine. When the pressure ebbed, I lay shaking on the floor, knowing with bitter clarity that what I had just endured was no accident. It was the archive's way of saying, this is how silence composes, by fire, by flood, by the subtraction of voices too loud for the grammar of stone. I rose unsteadily. My mind tried to rebel, whispering that these were hallucinations, stress-born illusions. But every nerve knew better. The pylons had shown me consequences of the past. These corridors were showing me tools for the future. I was being initiated into their language, not with words, but with survival scenarios, as if to teach me what levers they had always been willing to pull. A third pressure followed, sharper than the rest. The air tasted metallic, bitter. My vision blurred with an ache like fever. I saw fields shrivel, animals stumble on brittle legs, rivers retreat into cracked basins. It was not impact, not deluge. It was famine stretched across centuries, a strangulation, so slow that life itself would forget it once breathed fully. The corridor's hum sharpened into a single sustained note until I fell to my knees, clutching my stomach, certain that something had been taken from me. When the pressure finally dissolved, I knew what it meant. Fire, flood, famine. 3 verses of one song. Their orchestra was planetary. Their instrument was extinction itself. I leaned against the wall, trembling. I had come here searching for evidence of an ancient civilization. What I found was something worse. A will that had learned to wield disaster the way a composer shapes chords. And the more I thought, the clearer it became. Extinction events were not simply accidents of geology or chance. They could be orchestrations, timed to silence the surface when the noise grew unbearable. My chest heaved. The corridor softened, widening to give me space. I sensed no malice, only indifference. To this system, extinction was not cruelty. It was maintenance. Fire cleanses, flood resets, famine balances. The earth survives by subtraction, and they, whoever they were, had merely taught it how to sing those subtractions into permanence. A draught tugged at me, leading deeper. The hum grew quieter, but not weaker. The silence beyond was layered, almost thick, as though the corridor were preparing me for something vaster. My body ached, but my mind refused retreat. I needed to see the heart of this grammar, the place where choice had been written into stone, because if the composition was beginning again, then somewhere ahead lay the conductor, or the echo of one, and I had to face whether we were already inside their song. The passage narrowed until it felt like a throat, and then it opened without warning into an oval room so quiet my pulse sounded like a trespass. Nothing moved. No vents sighed. The stillness here had weight, like cloth laid over a face. I waited, expecting pressure to seize my lungs again, but the room offered only a pause long enough to force honesty. If their composition was beginning again, what would I choose if given even a fraction of its baton? I thought of the hall that had replayed catastrophe as easily as a hand repeats a gesture, and a shame I couldn't name rows like heat from the floor. Part of me had admired the precision. What kind of person admires the clockwork of extinction? The walls were not smooth so much as undecided, a surface that seemed to prefer potential to form. When I stepped closer, the undecidedness clarified into veins, threads of dull radiance braided within the stone, quivering faintly in time with my breath. The room wasn't measuring footsteps now, it was measuring confession. I said nothing. Secrets speak loudest when kept. A single dais rose from the centre of the floor, hardly a seat, more a low curve that accepted weight without insisting on it. Across its rim ran the hated geometry, angles flirting with rightness, adjusting, refusing to settle. I lowered myself onto it and felt how the stone learned me, hips, spine, shoulders, until I was held as securely as in a parent's hands. The air cooled against my face, and without light or sound the room began to show me the only landscape it trusted. Consequences. Not fire this time, nor flood, nor famine. It showed a city. Our kind of city. Breathing in heat it did not know how to release. building upward into a sky that clenched in response. Streets gleamed, towers whispered to one another in the weatherless tongue of built things, and far below, the patient grammar of stone listened like a teacher waiting for a child to exhaust its tantrum. No meteors, no walls of water, just a slow tightening of tolerances. Crops failed, not everywhere at once, but in a braided cadence. Shorelines unlearned their shapes. The composition here required no single blow. It required a conductor willing to prefer centuries of adjustment over the drama of an ending. Mercy weaponized into patience. "Stop," I whispered before I knew I'd spoken. The veins dimmed. The vision rested. Those same veins brightened when my breath steadied again, and a realization cut me clean. There was no single conductor ahead to confront. No figure waiting with a wand. The room had been designed to become a conductor whenever a measured mind sat inside it. The baton was distributed, not owned. A civilization that lived by concealment would never leave its power to one throat that could be cut. It braided control into rooms that read intention, the way our lungs read air. Memory, uninvited, slid its hand through mine. A mine collapse when I was young, a siren echoing through rock, the taste of dust. We waited in a ribbon of daylight while men below learned the difference between stone that holds and stone that lies. Hours later, the rescued faces emerged, greyed with fear, grateful in a way that made noise seem obscene. I had loved the earth from that day with a child's bargain. Hold us, and we will listen. Now, sitting on a seat that listened back, I understood how small our bargain had been. A tension threaded the room, finer than a hair, tugging not at body but at choice. It did not tempt me to unleash ruin. It invited me to approve a calibration already humming into place, the way a surgeon nods before an incision that must be made. The veins brightened along two arcs, one slow, one slower. No third line offered never. The cruelty here was that restraint had been turned into instrument. To refuse either pace was to rise and leave, and the way back had already taught me what it does to exits. I stood, knees weak, and walked the perimeter as if more options might appear if I behaved like a patient student. Along the far wall I found a panel the size of my palm, flush with the undecided stone. It did not unfold. It waited. Beneath my fingertips, a tremor arranged itself into cadence. Not words, not numbers, but the shape of a question asked in breath. What will you conserve? Comfort or continuity? The room had no interest in my fear, only in my answer. Hooked by despair and love in equal measure, I imagined the underworld at its birth. Portal poured into magma, halls coaxed out of chaos, a people choosing to be rumour rather than kings. Survival had cost them the sun. What would ours cost us? If I declined to touch the panel, perhaps nothing would change in this room. Outside, though, the grammar might continue its composition with or without my consent, as it always had. Maybe the only choice given to those who find the baton is to refuse to hold it while the orchestra plays on. The veins dimmed to a patient dusk. I felt the tiniest pull of air toward the panel, the gentlest of gravities, not coercion, attention. Whatever slept here woke only to listeners. I could not claim ignorance any more. I could only decide what kind of participant to become. So I set my palm upon the waiting stone, not to command, but to be judged. The contact was immediate. A heat not of fire but of recognition climbed through my skin, threading veins, lungs, and marrow until I was less a body than an instrument strung tight. The panel did not glow. Instead, the veins in the walls brightened, slowly at first, then pulsing in time with my pulse, until I could no longer tell which rhythm belonged to whom. My breath grew shallow. The stone wasn't reading me. It was rewriting me into its cadence. I braced for another storm of visions, but what arrived was stranger. The room folded into a stillness so complete I could hear the movements of my own organs, every twitch of muscle, every rush of blood. And beneath that intimacy, Another sound emerged, faint and terrible. A chorus, not loud but countless, voices of stone speaking without words. It was not language, not thought, but memory distributed across walls, floors, ceilings, as if every chamber in this buried empire whispered through the veins at once. I realised, shuddering, that the judgment I'd asked for was not from a room. It was from the network itself. The chorus pressed into me images without pictures, truths without words. I felt the weight of ages when silence had been chosen deliberately. Moments when something above grew too curious, too loud, too unstable. Each time the grammar responded. I saw a continent fracture, and only later did our historians name it natural. I felt ash close the sky, and only later did textbooks call it coincidence. Again and again their hand was erased, their baton dissolved into chance, yet the rhythm never ceased. They had been tuning the planet since before the surface had language to blame, and now the chorus turned its pressure fully upon me. A single idea unfurled inside my chest. Continuation demands sacrifice. The words were not spoken, but I knew them as clearly as if carved into my bones. It did not ask me whether I agreed. It asked me whether I understood. I tried to pull my palm away, but the stone clung with warmth that was not grip but gravity. The veins brightened sharper, and the question repeated, quieter this time, like a teacher patient with a child. Continuation demands sacrifice. I shook my head, whispered, "Not mine." The air thickened, a pause so profound it felt like a disappointed parent staring through me. Then the warmth receded, granting me back my hand. But as I pulled away, the room gave me one last vision, and this was the cruelest. I saw not fire, not flood, not famine, but something subtler. Our own cities, centuries from now, stripped not by disaster, but by erasure. Walls smooth as dunes, towers melted into hills, streets converted into stone so ordinary no one would know they had ever been streets at all. It was not destruction. It was forgetting so perfect it became forgiveness. I staggered from the dais, chest heaving. If that vision was warning, then the composition had already begun. The grammar was moving, perhaps slowly, perhaps invisibly, but always forward. Our age, too, might one day be remembered only by a single shaft or pillar glimpsed and dismissed, mistaken for geology. We would be another cadence in their long song of subtraction. The corridor ahead sighed open, as if satisfied that judgment had been given. I stepped through, legs weak, carrying not answers but a wound of knowledge too vast to bear. My notebook was gone, lost to the abyss above. But even if I had it, what would I write? How could paper hold the weight of silence turned into system, extinction turned into patience? The new passage sloped downward again, narrower, rougher. It felt different from the crafted perfection before. These walls bore scars, fractures half-healed, flows of once-molten stone. I realised with dread that I was no longer walking through sanctuaries of control, but through the evidence of battles fought long before I arrived. Something had forced this network to bleed, and in doing so, left marks that even their perfection could not erase. The air thickened with the smell of minerals, sharp, metallic, unsettlingly close to blood. My ears caught faint irregularities in the hum, no longer pure cadence, but fractures in the rhythm, dissonances creeping through. If the network was still alive, then it was not unbroken. Somewhere ahead, silence itself had been wounded, and that was the soft twist that chilled me most. Perfection had not always prevailed. Something, once, had resisted their grammar. The question that consumed me now was whether that resistance had been theirs, or another presence entirely. The corridor's hum faltered as if the stone itself disliked the question. I moved deeper into the wounded passage where perfection had buckled. Here the walls no longer corrected themselves toward that uneasy, almost right, They bore slices of exactness like scars, slabs met at true 90, clean and pitiless, and the air behaved differently between them, gathering into corners the way windstalls at the mouth of a square well. It felt wrong, not because it was crude, but because it was too perfect. If the network spoke in near angles to hide, someone had answered in right angles to reveal. I tested the room with the smallest note from my throat. For the first time since entering this underworld, sound came back to me. Not absorbed, not translated, returned. A thin echo, brittle as frost, bounced from corner to corner and tapped my ear like a fingernail on glass. The echo was imperfect, but it existed, and the meaning chilled me. This chamber had been built, or broken, to defy the listening grammar. Echo is a flare. Echo says, here. Who would light a flare inside a city designed to erase itself? Fragments littered the floor, dull even under my light. I knelt and found them to be panels as thin as a fingernail and as stubborn as stone, their surfaces etched not with spirals but with grids. I pressed one. Heat did not rise. Instead, the panel took the temperature of my palm and held it without sharing, like a withheld reply. Another panel did the same. I set two at right angles and hummed again. The echo sharpened, grew a spine, climbed. My stomach flipped. Perfection here was not decoration. It was weapon. A fissure cut the far wall from ceiling to floor, its edges melted and then broken again, as if two intentions had wrestled until neither could finish. The smell in that crack was mineral and metallic with a sour thread I couldn't place, like lightning striking dust. When I leaned close, the stone shivered in a way I had not felt before. Not pulse, not pressure, but recoil. Something in this place remembered pain. It was easier, somehow, to think of a war among engineers than a war with an invading species. Perhaps the resistance was theirs, a faction refusing the arithmetic of extinction. Or perhaps something else had burrowed in from deeper darkness, a counter-grammar, civilization of squares that survived by making the earth echo itself to wakefulness. I stepped carefully to the fissure and set my palm on its edge. No welcoming warmth, no patient question, only a low, irregular flutter, like a trapped bird exhausting itself against wires. I whispered, almost apologising, and felt ridiculous for apologising to stone. Yet the flutter eased. Somewhere in my chest a knot loosened in response. You can't help sympathising with a wound once it answers your touch. The psychological truth uncoiled with it. I wanted the network to be cruel, so I could be righteous about resisting it. But cruelty wasn't what I had found. I had found maintenance without mercy, a logic that preferred continuity to comfort. If this square-chambered resistance had risen from within, it meant some of them had loved comfort more than continuity, or loved the lives above enough to refuse subtraction. Which of those loves was more human? Which would I choose if a baton lay in my hand? A narrow seam opened near my boot, and a line of cold air traced my ankle like a measuring string. The floor brightened in a thin path leading toward a lower arch I hadn't seen, then faded as if to say, decide quickly. I resisted the path and instead arranged 3 of the panels into a corner on the floor. The echo suite answered again, stronger, layering my breath back onto me with a faint delay. I pictured this room filled with corners upon corners, a lattice of rightness knitting an audible skeleton inside the silent body of the city. A sabotage that turned listening rooms into mirrors. Somewhere, long ago, someone had tried to make the underworld betray its own position to the surface. The moral fracture inside me widened. If I helped the squares, I might be helping a mercy the surface could use, noise to cool down, noise to warn. But if I helped them, I might also be ending the only system that had ever proven it could hold the planet steady when fire fell. What did I love more? A future loud with fragile lives, or an earth that endures by subtracting them? I thought of the miner's hum, the canyon's tunnel, the pillar that taught me silence, the hall that taught me consequences. I thought of the vision the dais had shown. Our towers melted into anonymous hills, and I hated that part of me had felt relief at the thought of a planet finally free of our noise. That was the confession the room had weighed. That was why its question had asked what I would conserve. The fissure exhaled. Dust lifted in a thin veil and drifted toward the lower arch, caught by a current I could not feel on my skin. My choice had been pre-measured. The path wanted witnesses, not collaborators. I took one panel with me, a square set against a spiral, and ducked beneath the arch. The passage beyond sank a few metres and flattened into a hall that ran counter to everything above it. No spirals, no gentle corrections, only geometry disciplined into a grid so strict the air itself felt caged. I tried a note. The echo came back at once, stacked and doubled. At the far end, the hall widened into a black door frame cut with absolute precision, a mouth that would admit me but not my hope to remain unchanged. I took one more step, and the echo did something it had never done underground. It moved toward me. It peeled itself off the walls like skin from water and arrived as a second set of breaths. Not mine, timed to mine, entering the hall from the darkness ahead. My chest locked as though the air itself had grown hands. I froze mid-step, and the borrowed breath froze with me. It was not echo, not delay. It was simultaneous. A twin respiration inhabiting the same rhythm, a presence rehearsed in my cadence. I whispered a single word, anything to break the silence. Who? The answer came back not as echo but as sound riding beside my own. The same word layered upon itself like two singers bound to one sheet of music. My throat burned. I was not alone. The grid-lined hall glowed faintly at its seams, an austere geometry that left no shadows. From the black door frame ahead, the second breathing grew steadier, calm, patient. I tried to retreat a step, but the air behind me stiffened, resisting like glass. The hall had shut. I was contained. The realization that had stalked me since the canyon now stood undeniable. This place was not built to be discovered. It was built to discover intruders. The figure emerged without figure, a displacement rather than a shape. My eyes wanted to see body. The hall refused. What came forward was pattern. Squares tessellating into form. Lines at true right angles stacking into a humanoid outline that shimmered with rigidity. No spiral, no restless near angle here. This was the opposition, the counter-grammar that had scarred the veins. It exhaled with me, its chest an architecture of cubes that flexed against the air. Not illusion, not memory, a presence built from the resistance I had only guessed at. It paused a few strides away, as though it too was measuring. My instinct screamed to run, but nowhere remained to run. Instead, I lifted the panel I had carried from the fissure. Its gridwork pulsed faintly in my hand, answering the presence like a beacon. The breathing aligned tighter as if in recognition. I dared a single question, though my voice was thinner than I wanted. "Are you them?" The reply was not sound. The walls vibrated, each square panelling flexing once in unison. The impression came sharp and simple. Not them. Against them. My skin prickled. The war I had sensed in the wounded passages was no metaphor. There had been a fracture in the underworld, a division between those who composed silence and those who rebelled with echo. And here, in this sterile hall, I stood face to face with their descent. The presence tilted its head, an angle too precise to belong to flesh. My panel vibrated, warming, and images filled me unbidden. Chambers of spirals collapsing, ventilation shafts clogged by deliberate collapse, pylons cracked into uselessness. This counter-civilization had not been silent rebels. They had been saboteurs crafting right angles to fracture the spiral song, injecting echo where there should have been erasure. Theirs was not patience. Theirs was alarm. I staggered beneath the flood of impressions. For the first time, the underworld ceased to feel eternal. It had been contested, fractured, wounded. These halls were not the calm legacy of a single will. They were scars of a war fought in geometries, in grammars, in choices about whether to let the surface burn or to shout until it noticed. Two philosophies etched into stone. Continuity versus conscience. One willing to sacrifice life for survival, the other willing to risk survival for truth. The figure leaned forward. Its breaths did not speed. Mine did. My lungs threatened collapse trying to match its impossible calm. Then, with a movement slow as geology, it extended a hand. Rigid, square, unbearable in its exactness. The gesture was unmistakable, offering, not threat. My own hand trembled around the panel. To take that hand was to accept Echo as ally. To refuse was to remain with the spiral, to stay hidden in a grammar of silence. The hall darkened slightly, a storm gathering in stone. Pressure built behind the walls, as if the spiral network itself had noticed this encounter. My ribs vibrated with its hum, the familiar near-right cadence pushing back against the figure's clean rightness. Two forces clashing in the marrow of the earth, and I stood between them, a single animal measured by both. The choice cut sharper than any blade. Align with silence and inherit their cold endurance, or align with echo and risk unleashing a rebellion that might burn the world louder than any fire. The figure's hand waited, steady, exact. Behind me, the spiral's hum surged, reminding me that mercy here had always meant subtraction. And in that unbearable convergence, one truth crystallized. Whatever I chose, the earth itself would remember. Because this was no longer about their war. It was about whether I would allow myself to become part of it. The hall held the sentence like a specimen, turning it from every side without cracking the glass. The grid breath beside mine stayed patient, implacable. I felt the tug of both grammars, the spiral's hush pressing from behind, the square's clean echo bracing my ribs from ahead. Each a climate the body could learn to live in if it surrendered long enough. I flexed my fingers around the panel I had carried from the fissure. Its edges were too right, its skin too calm. Between thumb and forefinger, the underworld trembled with two different kinds of certainty, and I understood that either could devour doubt if I let it. The figure's offered hand remained steady. It was not a threat, not a demand, only a shape waiting for an answer measured in skin. I studied its geometry the way sailors study weather, edges stacked evenly, planes refusing curve, a discipline that made beauty feel like accusation. The spiral had taught me to keep my voice small. The square taught me to let sound be brave. I tried a note, barely louder than breath. It came back to me at once, lean and clear, riding the lattice to my ear with a crispness that felt like a promise. If you choose us, nothing will be lost to silence again. But the promise wore teeth I could not ignore. Echo announces, Echo alerts. Echo calls down storms as easily as it calls down help. I pictured the halls I had passed, the siphoning domes, the listening wells, the room of veins that turned anyone patient into a conductor, and I felt how the spiral had made an art of harm without hatred. It would erase us gently, with patience so refined we might thank it for the quiet as we vanished. The square would refuse that erasure, would raise a flare in the lungs of the earth and shout until the surface woke. To wake a sleeping giant is also a kind of violence. I took a step closer. The temperature of the hall changed by a whisper. Cooler at the corners, warmer at the centre, like an organism regulating itself around two clashing fevers. A hairline crack ran across one tile at my feet, almost invisible, a flaw the right angles could not correct without surrendering their identity. I knelt to touch it. The tile hummed faintly, not the spiral's near-right murmur, not the square's brisk reply, but a third tone, thin and stubborn, the sound a seam makes when it refuses to heal the way either surgeon intended. The underworld was not only two empires, it was the fracture between them. Memory barged in, uninvited, a childhood winter where the town's siren failed during a blizzard, and we learned to listen to the dark for what it was, not what we hoped it might be. Our breaths had sounded huge in that small house. My mother placed a finger to her lips, teaching me the first rule of survival. Sometimes silence is how a room holds you. Later, a rescuer's shout cut through, startling as lightning, a square of sound that announced the world's return. Both saved us, the hush that kept us still, the cry that found us. I wanted both. The hall would not allow both. The figure inclined its head, the motion tiled into precise increments. Its breath matched mine again, but slower, guiding rather than mimicking. Behind me, the spiral's hum lowered, not retreating, simply deepening, the way oceans do when they absorb a storm. They were courting me with climates. Stone can be gentle when it needs allegiance. I raised the panel. Its grid brightened, a frostwork of lines knitting tighter, until the square hand across from me glowed with the same disciplined cold. The brightness did not spill. It held to edges as if edges owned it. I thought of the portal. The ladder of light poured through cloud into rock, a perfect line that refused to widen into mercy. Perhaps the square had always been in their arrival, and the spiral was the compromise they made to survive beneath teeth and thunder. Or perhaps the square was the defect they never burned out, a conscience that could not abide subtraction. The air around the doorframe stirred, a soft cross-current like pages turning in a book I could not read. From deep beyond, a far slow throb answered, not threat but heartbeat, some larger chamber marking time. The ground beneath my boots learned my weight again, recalculating with each hesitation, patient, relentless. The underworld had no hurry. I did. Every breath I shared with the square felt like a decision advancing by degrees. I tested one last question, not with words, with posture. I lowered the panel to my side and spread my fingers, empty. The figure's breath did not change. Its hand did not withdraw. It waited for consent without pleading. The spiral's hum behind me smoothed into a single low note that filled the hall's margins with tide. I realised they were both teaching me the same lesson with opposite instruments. Power that does not need to prove itself can afford patience. The tiny crack at my feet buzzed again, the third tone. It was enough. I could not make the fracture choose for me, but I could choose to stand on it. I set my boot across the seam and felt its stubbornness rise into my bones, a reminder that refusing to decide is also a decision that others will complete for you. My palm opened. The panel cooled. The breath beside me steadied into something like trust. I reached forward, not to pledge a lifetime, not to ignite a war, but to admit I would rather risk a shout than be erased without a sound. I took its hand. The instant contact was not warmth but structure, a geometry folding into my skin. My palm tingled as though every nerve had been forced into alignment with something older, stricter. For a breath I feared my hand would calcify into a square itself, stone joining stone. But instead a current ran through me, silent, crisp, alive, and I realised this was no possession, it was synchronization. The presence's grip was steady, neither firm nor weak, but absolute in its refusal to waver. My breath matched its rhythm as if lungs had become clockwork. Behind me the spiral's low hum faltered, shrinking to a murmur almost resentful. I was aware of its withdrawal the way a child notices a parent step out of a room. The safety net pulled back, leaving the weight of my choice unsoftened. The hall brightened, not with the warm pulses of the veins I'd seen earlier, but with a pale lattice unfurling across the walls and ceiling, grids stacking upon grids until the space felt less like a room and more like the inside of a crystalline engine. The figure moved closer, still holding my hand, and as it did, the lattice hummed, not in song but in something nearer to code. The sound was squared off, clipped, exact. Every syllable of vibration felt like a command, though I could not translate its content. Images bled into me through the contact. Not visions like the spiral had shown. Those had been atmospheric, impressionistic. These were diagrams, precise and deliberate. I saw a shaft collapsing under deliberate detonation. I saw vents redirected to flood entire galleries with choking gas. I saw panels like the one I carried, arranged into lattices that bent sound until silence cracked open like bone. This was their rebellion. Not chaos but counter-architecture. Not rage but design. And in the margins of those diagrams, something more human than any of it. Urgency. Where the spiral offered patience, infinite rehearsals of subtraction, the square bled anxiety. It could not wait centuries for correction. It needed action now. My ribs felt the difference. Where the spiral hummed like tide, the square raced like pulse. I wanted to speak, to ask what became of them, but the grip hardened slightly, silencing me. Words, it seemed, were a spiral invention. Here the grammar was built from pattern, not speech. So I let the square teach me in diagrams and rhythms. The lesson was brutal. Mercy in the spiral's tongue meant survival without us. Mercy in the square's tongue meant survival because of us. Both insisted they were right. The figure released my hand. I nearly stumbled at the severing of its geometry, my own breath spilling into ragged imperfection again. It tilted its head once more, then gestured toward the black doorframe at the end of the hall. The lattice of grids contracted, funneling light toward that threshold, an arrow drawn in architecture. It wanted me to go forward. But behind me the spiral answered. Its hum swelled again, pushing into the hall with pressure like water rising in a chamber. The walls quivered with two overlapping grammars, spiral patience against square urgency. I felt the floor crackle beneath me, tiny fractures racing outward like frost as the clash of codes tore into the stone. The chamber had become a battlefield, and I was the fulcrum. The figure did not move to stop me, nor to help me. It simply waited, its square body unmoved even as the air split into competing pulses. The decision was mine. To walk through the door was to accept their rebellion, to step into a world that refused erasure. To turn back was to kneel once more to silence, to trust that subtraction was mercy. My throat burned with the pressure of both grammars, as if silence and echo were duelling inside my lungs. I remembered the fissure, the wound in the stone that had buzzed with its own stubborn note. I remembered how alive it had felt, unyielding to either side. That memory steadied me. Perhaps I did not need to join either empire. Perhaps my role was to carry the fracture forward. The air snapped, a whip of soundless pressure that slammed against my ears. I staggered toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to run before the clash collapsed the hall. The figure did not follow. It simply dissolved into the lattice, absorbed like ink into paper. I realized with a shiver that perhaps it had never been a being at all, but the echo of a rebellion made architecture. I crossed the threshold, lungs raw, body trembling. Beyond the door lay a stair spiralling down, not in near right angles, not in strict grids, but in a compromise of both, steps half curved, half straight, twisting into darkness like a negotiation written in stone. For the first time I wondered if the fracture had not been a failure at all. What if the fracture was their final design? The staircase that received me seemed to answer without sound. Each step was a compromise, a half curve meeting a half line, edges softened where angles would have cut. arcs trimmed where spirals would have drifted. My boot met surfaces that chose stability only as I committed weight, as if the stone preferred possibility until a body persuaded it to decide. The air here had two temperatures at once, a coolness collecting along the straight seams, a gentler warmth breathing from the rounded joins. I descended slowly, counting, breaths I could never quite keep even, because each inhale belonged to a different climate. Who builds a staircase that makes you practice balance with your lungs? At intervals, shallow bays opened from the stair like pauses in a sentence. In one, a small dome had been tuned to swallow sound on one side and return it on the other. A whisper walked in as hush and came back as echo, braided but not cancelled. I cupped my hands to the curved half and let out a thread of voice. It vanished. I turned to the flat half and repeated it. The note returned slender and true. Between them, along a thin median of undecided stone, my voice split and softened, becoming two quiet threads that never fused. This was neither erasure nor alarm. It was moderation, engineered into rock. Was that what the fracture meant? An agreement to bleed and to muffle by turns, so that neither empire could rule alone. Further down, the stair widened into a landing worked like a harp. Narrow ribs of stone rose from the floor, spiralled at their roots and squared at their tips, each bent a little differently. Air passed through them in alternating pulses, and the landing sang a low, unresolved chord that never reached a single key. The sound settled under my ribs like an unfinished thought. The longer I listened, the more I realised the chord was not a melody, but a metronome, calibrating me, drawing my hurried mind into a slower arithmetic. If the old halls had imposed silence and the square hall had imposed echo, this place imposed patience. A third grammar, not in between, but beyond. The walls bore marks I had not seen elsewhere, not the restless almost rights, not the pitiless grids, but knots, loops where spiral and square stitched through each other, tightening and releasing in patterns that felt like breath translated into braid. I traced one with a fingertip, and a faint warmth answered from both directions at once. It was the sensation of two hands on either side of a door, not pulling, not pushing, merely touching to prove they were there. Somewhere deep below, a slow throb approved. On a ledge carved into the landing's far side, I found the kind of evidence my training had taught me to distrust, because it asked to be believed. Soot. A faint ancient smear rising in a feathered crescent where a vent met the wall, too high and too deep for surface fire to have wandered in by accident. The smear had bled into the stone and then been frozen by the same patient chemistry that sealed everything here. I raised my light and saw, beside it, a shallow compression no natural heave of rock could make, oval with a narrow heel and a suggestion of crosshatch texture, impressed into mineral like the ghost of a tread. It faced downward, toward the steps I had yet to take. Someone had rested here. Someone had warmed their hands at a small illicit flame, and then stood to go deeper. I felt the landing's cord slide a fraction higher, not accusation, merely recognition. The compromise stair had been used before, and not by the architects of purity on either side. That thought filled the air with a thin, metallic taste that did not belong to minerals. It belonged to history arriving late. Were they like me, a single body following curiosity into a wound? Or were they many, organised by the square or permitted by the spiral to test the strength of the fracture? Beyond the landing, the stair tightened, and the stone took on a texture like dried clay pressed by woven fabric. Every few steps, a tiny baffle shifted in the wall, opening a hair's breadth and closing again, letting out a measured breath of warmer air. The rhythm reminded me of the pylon's long note, but fractured into little syllables, as if the underworld were whispering in a language invented only for this borderland. Twice I stopped, convinced the whisper was shaping a word. Twice it dissolved into pulse before my heart could translate. The compromise grew bolder the deeper I went. Vents that once swallowed heat now bent it sideways into chambers that hummed, then quieted. Panels like the one I'd carried from the square hall lay embedded flush with curving stone. When I brushed them, they didn't reject me or ignite. They recorded my touch as a soft, receding echo, a proof that I had passed, and then dimmed. A mercy I did not trust. The underworld taking notes instead of taking me. Every so often the stair kinked into a true corner, one right angle, only one, and at each I felt the earth's larger body shrug, a faint tectonic unease that wanted curve instead. Those corners were signatures, perhaps, or warnings set as relief valves. If a grid tried to colonize this depth, the planet itself would complain. If a spiral tried to erase every edge, the square would leave a bone of rightness lodged where the throat could not swallow it. The fracture was not a truce. It was a tension kept alive on purpose. I paused to drink the air, to let my breath choose a side and refuse both. The harp landing's chord faded behind me. Ahead, the stair ended in a low arch that showed nothing beyond it but black. The kind of black you feel with your skin first. I listened hard and heard 3 layers at once. The spiral's tide, the square's metronome, and under both, a quieter ticking, irregular and alive. The sound a small thing makes when it thinks no one is listening. I lowered my head to pass through the arch, and in that instant the ticking stopped, as if the small thing had heard me too. Then, in the dark ahead, something exhaled that was neither stone nor system, and a breath answered mine that belonged to no architecture at all. The air shifted as though lungs had claimed it. I froze, throat locked, and felt the presence not as geometry, not as echo or hush, but as weight. A body-sized pause that bent space around it. My eyes strained against the dark, but sight here was a liar. The exhalation returned, softer this time, and in it I heard something terrifyingly human. Fatigue. Whoever or whatever lingered here was tired, not timeless. I took a step, and the stone beneath me replied with a sigh too slow to be accident. I realised the underworld was listening not to my feet, but to what stood before me. The fracture had been a stage. This, it seemed, was the audience. I whispered one word. Who? And the blackness bent, a ripple moving across it like fabric disturbed by wind. Then light, faint and trembling, spilled into the archway, not from torch or vent, but from a thin circlet balanced upon a brow I could only partly see. The face beneath it was not fossil, not statue. It was alive, impossibly alive. Skin so pale it might have been drawn from stone itself, eyes adjusted to dark in ways mine could not comprehend. And in those eyes, a recognition that pulled my stomach inside out. They had been waiting. The being's lips parted, and I expected silence. The spiral's grammar. Instead, a voice emerged. Not echo, not hum, but voice. Rasped, low, carrying centuries of restraint. You are late. I staggered back, mind flailing for reason. Late? Not lost, not trespassing. Late. As though my arrival had been scheduled, as though the fracture itself had been a summons. The being raised one hand, delicate yet sure, and from the air above its palm the compromise patterns I'd seen on the staircase spun like diagrams. Arcs knotted with grids, threads weaving square and spiral into living braids. They rotated slowly, waiting for me to understand. My chest ached with a question I could barely speak. You survived? The figure tilted its head. The light of the circlet flared once, then steadied. Survival is not enough. We endured. The difference in those words struck deeper than any stone. Survival is accident. Endurance is choice. They had not simply hidden under the fire of skies or the collapse of worlds. They had continued, unseen, shaping fractures into languages of their own. Behind me, I felt the spiral hum rise in protest, a low tidal moan shaking dust from the stair. Ahead, in the being's voice, urgency burned like a second heartbeat. "Do you know what falls above us?" I shook my head, though I already feared the answer. The same stone, the same fire, the same cycle that ended them once. It comes again. The surface still does not listen. And you, here the figure's eyes fixed on mine, impossibly sharp in the faint glow, you are proof they must. Every word collapsed centuries of silence into a demand. My knees felt hollow. I had thought myself an intruder into ruins, but no, this was not ruin. This was refuge, an ark of endurance waiting for a messenger foolish enough to stumble into its halls. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but the chamber allowed none. The air thickened, pressing on my chest until only one sentence could escape. "Why me?" The being's hand closed, extinguishing the diagrams, leaving only the circlet's glow. Its voice answered with the weight of inevitability. "Because you still breathe both. Both. The spiral's hush and the square's echo alive in me since the fissure, sharpened by the halls, fused in my lungs without my choosing. I was fracture given flesh. They had not summoned me for discovery. They had summoned me for choice." The chamber rumbled low and distant. Dust fell in a thin rain from the arch behind me. The spiral was not pleased. The square was not silent either. Somewhere in the stone, grids pulsed impatiently. Both sides knew I had met their compromise. The being's eyes did not leave mine. "Will you carry us upward?" it asked, the words both plea and command. My breath stuttered, torn between yes and no, between salvation and catastrophe. I looked back at the stair. The braid of stone that had taught me refusal itself was a decision. The underworld waited, holding its breath, forcing me to answer. And in that unbearable pause I realised the third twist. We had not been the first to descend, and if I refused, I would not be the last. The words hung between us like a bridge I had not agreed to cross. The being's circle it dimmed until it was only a rim of breath around a thought, and I sensed the patience of ages arranging itself so I could understand a scale that had never needed me. I looked past the figure into a chamber whose floor sloped gently away, as if the earth itself were bowing to an absent throne. Along the slope, ribs of fused stone rose like quiet metronomes. Between them lay shallow hollows, each the length of a body, each etched with that braided grammar of spiral and square. They were not tombs, they were beds for travellers who wished to become instruments. The being stepped aside and the ribs brightened in a cadence I could feel in my teeth. Ribs 3 and 7 answered my pulse. 5 answered the low tide of the spiral. 2 and 11 clicked to the lean rightness of the square. They came, the voice rasped, when the sky taught its old lesson. Some became echo, some became hush, one became both. The last word fell like a stone into a well that had no bottom. A question rose before fear could weaken it. Where did they go? The slope replied, not with images, but with pressure that laid histories along my bones. One walked upward and spoke until kings called him mad. His warnings became songs about serpents in the ground. One stayed and tuned the vents to draw poison down. The surface called the summer merciful and forgot the price. One wandered the middle halls for a lifetime mapping knots. The map outlived him, folded into the rock like a second circulatory system. None were saviours, all were hinges. The chamber did not glorify them. It only acknowledged the turns they allowed. "Why call me late?" I whispered, ashamed of the tremor in my mouth. "Because the composition has begun its first bar," the being said, and the ribs answered with a shiver that travelled like weather. "There is still a rest to place, a pause that buys time, but only from the surface can the pause be cut clean." "How?" The word left me smaller than I wanted to be. The being lifted its hand again, and a diagram threaded the air. 3 vents far from one another, opening like pupils toward different skies. I recognised the logic at once. The desert ridge that had first whispered to me, a coastline where cliffs sang to storms, a mountain whose belly tasted lightning more often than rain. At each location, the diagram braided spiral and square into a single knot, tightened to a point that looked like stillness, but was actually decision held in tension. "Set these," the voice said, "and resonance will turn outward, not inward. The surface will hear itself. It will feel the old danger before we must darken it." "What do these knots do to the world?" I asked, already fearing the answer. "They frighten it," being said simply, "not with ruin, with clarity." A hook of doubt slid under my ribs. Clarity is its own catastrophe when denial has been a culture. "If the surface refuses to listen even then?" The circlet brightened a fraction. "Then the baton returns to us." The sentence carried no threat, only geometry, but geometry can be inexorable. I walked the slope, touching a rib here, a hollow there, and felt faint after pressures rise and fade like handshakes from people long gone who had once stood where I stood. The third major truth revealed itself not as revelation, but as acceptance. The war between echo and hush had not ended in victory. It had matured into a protocol. The fracture was not a weakness, it was a tool. Spiral and square would wrestle forever by design, so that each age had a chance to choose pause before subtraction. "Why can't you go up?" I asked, turning back. "If you endured, why not carry your own warning?" The being's eyes narrowed against a pain I could not see. "We are tuned to depth. The surface burns us. Your lungs carry both climates. You can cross where we cannot." It lifted its other hand. A small object lay upon the palm, dull as a pebble until my gaze found it. Then its geometry sharpened into a knot of planes that refused to decide if they were curved or straight. "Take one, set 3. I didn't move. "And the price?" "Price," the being repeated, tasting the word as though it belonged to a language it had once used and abandoned. "You will be counted. The network above will measure you forever. The halls below will no longer erase you. We will not be able to forget you, even if you ask us to." The honesty steadied me more than comfort could. I took the object. It weighed almost nothing and seemed to hum with a patience that made my fingers feel hurried. As I closed my hand, the chamber's ribs shifted into a lower key, and the spiral's distant tide answered with a single steady note. Neither welcoming nor denying. The square in the stone exhaled, approval or relief. "Show me the first vent," I said, because all hesitation now would harden into excuses. The being lifted a finger. Far above, something moved like a thought deciding to become weather. The slope brightened under my feet, and a path unspooled toward a throat of darkness that leaned upward rather than down. The underworld had opened a vein that climbed. I looked back only once. The being's face was already fading into patience. "Carry us upward," it said, "and make the surface listen before we make it quiet." I stepped into the climbing vein, the knot warm against my pulse, and as the stone gathered me like a slow wave, a final doubt scraped its nail along my heart. What if the surface, once forced to hear, learned only how to hate the voice that made it listen? The question followed me into the climbing vein like a second heartbeat, syncopated and stubborn. The stone shifted its texture around my body, at first damp and grainy, then dry as parchment, then slick with a mineral sheen that caught my skin as though tasting it. Each phase seemed to ask me, which of these surfaces will you become, the absorbent, the brittle, or the reflective? I clenched the knot in my palm and told myself I was only passing through. But the vein was a slow teacher, and every ascent whispered, "No one passes through unchanged." After what felt like hours of rising in darkness, the vein split. One branch curved sharply, warm air bleeding from its throat, smelling faintly of salt. The other widened into a tunnel that leaned cool and stale, carrying the memory of dry plains. I realised the diagrams I'd seen in the being's hand were not just maps, they were choices. I was already at the threshold of one vent. Salt meant sea. I imagined waves striking cliffs, spirals of spray climbing higher than I could follow. The knot in my hand pulsed faintly as though approving. Was it guiding me, or merely hungering for release? I crouched, pressing my ear to the tunnel's breath. The sea's voice was distant but insistent, as if it had been knocking for centuries at the same locked door. My doubt sharpened into a more dangerous fear. If the world was forced to hear, what if the sea chose to drown rather than listen? Still, the being's voice haunted me. Clarity, not ruin. I told myself clarity was a medicine, though bitter medicine has killed as often as healed. The tunnel narrowed, forcing me to crawl, the knot wedged against my chest. My heartbeat quickened until it felt like I was pounding out a rhythm the stone could record. Ahead, a faint light. Moonlight? Number. The sea itself reflecting starlight through a narrow slit. I dragged myself upward until my head emerged into air so cold and alive I nearly wept. I was kneeling on a ledge carved into a cliffside, the ocean stretching endless and silver beneath me. Waves smote the rock with a rhythm older than history. I could smell the iron of deep currents. The vent opened here, a mouth in the cliff, exhaling softly with each retreating wave, inhaling with each crash. I lifted the knot. For the first time it struggled in my hand as if eager. I felt spiral and square awaken within it, a tightening inward, a pushing outward, both demanding to be reconciled. My instructions had been simple. Set 3, and resonance would frighten the world awake. But here, faced with the living sea, simplicity dissolved. What if the resonance bent wrong? What if it cracked the tide into fury instead of clarity? Would the surface accuse me of saving it or curse me for shaking it? I thought of the being's eyes, bright with the patience of ages, and new hesitation would become betrayal. I placed the knot into the vent's mouth. It sank, not like a stone, but like a breath entering a lung. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then the cliff shuddered, low and resonant as though the rock itself had learned to sing. The sea answered, not louder, but sharper, each wave now carrying an undertone that did not belong to water. The air vibrated in my ribs, a note I could neither name nor forget. The knot was gone, fused with the cliff, its geometry dissolved into resonance. I leaned against the stone, drained, and felt the world's first pause begin to spread. Somewhere inland, sleepers would stir, hearts suddenly uneasy, dreams turned too vivid. Somewhere, birds would rise at night for no reason they could name. The sea had been tuned. The surface was listening, whether it wanted to or not. I should have felt triumph, but instead the dread deepened. If the first knot had carried such weight, what storms would the next unleash? Behind me, deep in the vent, a whisper moved like breath through a reed. 2 remain. The stone had spoken, or perhaps the underworld had found a way to remind me of its patience. Either way, the path was clear. I turned from the cliff, the sea's sharpened rhythm still echoing in my blood, and crawled back into the vein that waited. The second vent lay ahead, dry and merciless. But even as I pressed into the stone again, one thought lingered like a shadow I could not dislodge. If clarity itself becomes unbearable, will the surface demand silence again? The thought rode with me as the vein folded me back into the dark, the sea's sharpened rhythm still flickering under my ribs like a second tide. The stone pressed close, dry now, tasting of old bones and sunburnt clay, and I felt the world deciding what to do with the note I had set inside it. Warnings are a kind of light, I told myself. and light is always unwelcome to eyes that have trained themselves to love the dark. If they refuse to look, what music will the earth be forced to play next? The passage climbed, then levelled, then sloped into heat. Grain by grain, dust sifted against my cheeks as if the vein were sifting me back, asking what must be kept and what could be let go. On my palm, where the first knot had lived and gone, a coolness gathered. I opened my hand. The geometry that had fused with the cliff had left behind a residual pattern on skin, and from that pattern a second knot condensed, as if resonance itself could seed matter where it needed a messenger. It was smaller than the first, darker, and when I tilted it, it refused to catch light, choosing discretion over shine. I did not ask how. I accepted the gift exactly as the underworld intended, with no leverage and no illusions. Hot breath licked my face. The vein thinned into a throat so narrow I had to turn my shoulders to pass. Ahead, a glow the colour of old honey burned through a slit. I pressed my eye to it and saw a basin far below, a country of cracked flats veined with dried rivers, dunes like sleeping animals, distances that swallowed scale. The vent opened in the lee of a fossil ridge, its mouth disguised by a comb of stone that shredded wind into harmless tatters. Every few heartbeats, heat exhaled through that comb and the air sang a note too high for most ears to bother with, a desert tuned to indifference. I slid onto a ledge and let the sun blind me back into caution. The ridge kept its shadow like a promise. Signs of earlier hands were faint but present, scratches where none should be, a smudge where sand had melted into gloss, the ghost of a heel pressed once into soft grain and then turned to glass by heat. It faced the vent. Travellers had stood here before me, weighing whether to disturb a silence that knew how to survive without witnesses. The page remembered the pen even after the ink had gone. The knot lay quiet in my palm, neither urging nor sulking. I thought of the sea's answer, waves that had learned a syllable, and asked the desert what it would do with language if I offered one. What if the word I gave it became a scream? What if the scream multiplied until it was easier to kill the messenger than to hear the message? I could almost feel the patience of the spiral gathering below, sharpening its old knife, and the square's brisk urgency tapping the blade's spine, saying faster. To be fracture is to disappoint both. Timing would matter here. The vent inhaled heat and gravel. It exhaled something thinner, a ghost of breath the sun could not burn. I waited 3 cycles, 4, 5, watching the comb's tiny shadows inch and retreat, counting the rhythm into my bones. On the 6th exhale, I set the knot into the mouth and pressed my palm flat to the stone to keep from flinching. The ridge took the knot the way a throat takes a vow, without ceremony, without regret. Heat stepped backward. A tone ripened low in the rock, then spread outward in lazy circles, riding the bones of the basin. Dunes shifted, not as avalanches, but as listeners repositioning in a hall. The dried riverbeds trembled once, as if remembering a word they had not said in 1,000 years. Far out on the flats, a dust devil rose and unspooled in perfect silence, the dance of a snake reconsidering its strike. My chest filled with the taste of iron and heat and decision. This was not thunder. It was clarity turning the mirror of the air so the desert could see its own thirst. Somewhere a herd would startle and change its route. Somewhere a sleeping town would wake to a stillness so exact it would feel like guilt. If the sea had learned a syllable, the desert learned restraint. I sat in the shadow and let the tone pass through me, until my pulse found it and moved aside. One remains, the breath inside the vent said, no louder than a rumour, no kinder than a command. The knot's absence cooled my palm like water. Above the ridge the sky had begun to gather a seam, the mountain that east lightning was calling weather home. Back into the vein then, hands in the throat of stone, knees bruised by decision, lungs flirting with 2 climates at once. The ascent was steeper now, the rock rougher. as if the earth wanted to make sure I would bleed a little before I reached the last door. Between slabs I felt the square thrum like a wire drawn tight, eager. In the slower strata the spiral pooled like shade, patient. The compromise staircase below had taught me the cost of balance. The mountain would teach me the cost of failure. When the vein finally opened, cold bit so clean it felt like truth. I stepped into air that had been washed by altitude and thunder, the world falling away on every side until even fear had to hold on with both hands. The peak loomed ahead, scorched black in places where old fires had met rain, pale where stones had split from sudden frost. The last vent crowned a ridge that ran like a spine into cloud, its lip ringed with fused glass that remembered 1,000 storms. I tightened my fingers on the final knot that had grown from the pattern of my pulse, and the sky answered with a mutter deep enough to rattle the teeth of the mountain. I was exactly where the underworld had always meant me to stand. I began to climb toward the place where the storm would teach me whether warning can be louder than erasure. The path was no path at all, jagged ridges stacked like broken ribs, slate slick with recent hail, blackened stone scarred where lightning had written its history in crooked lines. Each step seemed borrowed, as if the mountain could revoke permission at any instant and send me tumbling into the void below. The knot in my hand pulsed faintly, echoing not my heartbeat, but the slow drum of thunder brewing overhead. I climbed until my legs shook and my breath cut itself against the thin air. Clouds bruised themselves into shape above me, folding and splitting as though debating whether to descend. Lightning flickered deep inside their bellies, silent for now, rehearsing its strike. I wondered if the sky, like the sea and the desert, would accept resonance, or if it would mock me, burn me, remind me that not all voices deserve an answer. The vent revealed itself as a black ring etched into the ridge's spine. Around its rim, fused glass glittered in shards, each piece warped as though the storm had tried to turn stone into memory but only half succeeded. The mouth itself did not exhale as the others had. It inhaled endlessly, a pull so subtle I felt my own breath shorten to match it. Standing before it was like standing in the throat of a giant that refused to swallow. I held the knot up. For the first time, it was not neutral. It strained, trembling, as if caught between dread and hunger. I understood. This was no simple vent. It was the conduit the sky itself had kept open, a vein through which fire and water and wind had spoken since before names were carved into stone. To offer resonance here would not only tune a region, it could tune the heavens themselves. I thought of the being in the underworld, its circlet glowing with patient flame, its voice promising endurance, clarity, not ruin. But clarity at this height, clarity written into thunder, could split mountains, could blind villages with fear, could force the surface to listen so hard that they forgot how to think. Was that salvation or dictatorship of sound? Thunder cracked, near this time, close enough to shake pebbles loose at my feet. The storm was done waiting. I stepped closer to the vent and felt my hair lift, charged by the sky's impatience. My knuckles whitened around the knot. I remembered the staircase below, its braids of refusal, its demand that each step be a choice, not a drift. Perhaps this too was a step, not whether to set the knot, but how. If I threw it in with desperation, the storm would answer with violence. If I offered it as confession, perhaps the sky would restrain itself. The underworld had not taught obedience, it had taught responsibility. I knelt, pressed the knot to my chest, and whispered, not to the vent, not to the sky, but of the fracture that had always lived inside me. Do not ask for silence, do not ask for terror, ask only to be heard. My hand lowered, steady now, and I set the knot onto the glass ring. At first, nothing. Then the mountain's teeth clenched. Lightning tore downward, not to strike me, but to braid itself with the vent's black mouth. A column of light thicker than any tree plunged into the ridge, and the knot vanished in its grip. Sound followed. Not thunder, not yet, but a vibration so total it erased the line between bone and stone. My body quivered like a string caught in perfect tuning. The storm did not break. It changed. Instead of random fury, its lightning began to pulse in measured intervals, each bolt shaped into rhythm, each echo folding back into the next. Thunder rolled not as chaos, but as a chant, low and terrible, the kind of sound that pulled every living creature to attention. For the first time since I had entered the underworld, I felt the surface itself pause, not just waves or dunes, but fields, forests, cities. The earth had been made to listen. The vent glowed with molten light, its rim softening into a perfect circle, the knot sacrifice fused into a permanent doorway. My skin burned from proximity, but I didn't move. The work was complete. 3 knots, 3 voices, sea, desert, storm, braided into one resonance. Above me the clouds tore open, not to release rain, but to reveal a depth of sky so dark and clean it seemed newborn. Stars scattered themselves in that wound, sharp and bright as glass. For a moment, clarity reigned. The world had been spoken to. But even as I stood trembling on the ridge, I heard another sound rising from beneath, from deeper than any vent or vein I had yet touched. Not warning, not clarity, but something older still. The underworld itself had begun to answer. It came first as a counter-rhythm under the mountain's chant, a second pulse threading the thunder's measured intervals the way a low drum threads a procession. I felt it in the soles of my feet, then in my knees, then higher, until my ribs were a row of doors, the beat opened one by one. The sky's clarity held, stars cut clean through torn cloud. But under that terrible brightness the ground gathered its old breath. The spiral's tide returned, not to erase, but to encircle. The square's metronome ticked inside it like a flint, and between them the compromise chord I had learned on the harp landing rose, unfinished and insistent, asking if the world would bear hearing itself for longer than a heartbeat. I listened harder, and the mountain translated pressure into understanding. The underworld did not approve or scold, it assessed. 3 knots set, 3 regions tuned. Water, sand, storm. Resonance had moved outward, not inward, and for the first time in an age the surface stood inside a mirror it could not lower. Far off, I felt coastal cliffs stiffen as towns at their feet woke to an ocean that spoke. I felt dunes hesitate like animals relearning discipline. I felt high lakes lift their skins in shy astonishment at a sky that finally sang in time. But braided through those sensations was panic too, the tight animal awareness that clarity can slice the mind if it arrives faster than humility. Beneath all that, the deeper pulse swelled. I understood its grammar now. Question, answer, question. Do they listen? A rise from under rock. They stir. A reply from sky and sea and sand. Will they act? The second question, heavier, the old baton hovering where anyone might reach. I closed my eyes against the stars, dizzy with the scale of it. Was this what those travellers had felt when they climbed back towards a light, with instructions in their hands, this vertigo, this fear of being mistaken for a herald when you're only a hinge? Lightning braided itself once more into the vent, then subsided to a blue thread. The mountain loosened its jaw. In that mercy of quiet I heard a thin chorus, at first easy to mistake for wind. Distant voices above and far away, people troubled in their sleep, birds taking off, in midnight flocks, motors stalling as if the road had forgotten them. Had the world heard? Or had I only sent a shiver through it, the way cold sends shivers through a child who will not put on a coat? How many nights does it take to train a species to attention? Another beat from below. Return. Not command, context. The underworld wanted a report, or perhaps it wanted to see whether my lungs still carried both climates after speaking to the open air. I looked down slope where the ridge fell away into night and imagined the vein opening for me somewhere in the basalt, a black throat prepared to drink me back. Then I looked up toward the fresh black wound in the clouds where stars burned like needles and imagined staying, walking the ridgeline into a city, into a room where sleep had tangled itself around a worry no one could name, saying only, listen, listen, listen. Which path saves more? Which path condemns less? My breath gusted white. The storm restitched its hem. The vent cooled, and in that cooling came a memory sharper than weather. The being's eyes, the gentle cruelty of its honesty. You will be counted. I felt it then. The counting. The network's soft abacus sliding a bead for every choice I made. Not surveillance. Record. A refusal to let me become legend or lie. Wasn't that its hardest mercy? To remember me against my will, so the next hinge would not imagine itself first. The ground pulsed again. The spiral pushed a long, patient note up my bones. The square tapped twice against my wrist. The compromise chord braided them with a third tone that belonged to neither. Mine. Was I still fracture? Or had the mountain polished me into allegiance without asking? The knot was gone. The path ahead was decisions. I knelt and laid my palm on the fused ring. Warmth answered. Not the fever of lightning, but the steady heat of a living stone. They've heard, I whispered. Some will pretend they haven't. The vent drank the words without echo. A breath from below agreed. Some always do. The reply was not bitter. It was arithmetical. The wind turned. Far down in the valleys, dogs barked in a staggered chain, then fell silent as if too much night had entered their throats. A plane's faint growl hesitated, circled, moved on. In some farmhouse a radio clicked itself awake with no hand to touch it. The mountain was not alone in answering. I rose, ankles trembling with cold, and the ridge seemed to lean a fraction toward the east, toward a darkness that held roads like quiet veins. Could I descend into that civilization now, carrying a voice the earth would amplify whether I wished it or not? Or must I go back beneath, to bring word and be measured by the circlet's patience? If I chose wrong, would the grammar correct me, or correct the world around me until my wrongness became fatal? The ground eased once more. Somewhere below, a vein unsealed with the quiet of a pupil widening. The invitation was unmistakable, and so was the risk. I stood on the edge of the ring, caught between sky that had learned to count and stone that had never forgotten how. I took a step toward the opening vein, and the mountain drew in a long, deliberate breath, as if the next sound would use my lungs to enter the world. The ground's inhalation shuddered through me like a prelude, a rehearsal for a note not yet sung. I could not tell if the mountain was waiting for me to descend, or if it was warning me that descent would cost me the last sliver of independence I carried. Above, the storm had fractured into ribbons, thin streaks of light pulsing with a rhythm I had given it. Below, the underworld opened its throat wider, offering no light at all, only the certainty of return. One choice promised witness, the other demanded obedience. I stood between them like a hinge with rusted joints, unsure whether bending one way or the other would break me. Yet the rhythm inside my bones had already decided. The spiral's endless sweep, the square's merciless ticks, the compromise cord threading them together like a tether through my chest. They pulled downward. The earth itself was summoning its courier. I lowered myself into the vein. The black stone closed around me, not with malice, but with familiarity, like the grip of a hand that had held me since the first descent. The warmth here was different, no longer volcanic, no longer storm-fed, but tempered, steady, like the pulse of a being so vast it no longer needed to prove itself. My breath synchronized with it without my permission. The mountain's breath was mine now. The descent was shorter this time. The stone did not twist me. didn't test me with labyrinthine veins. It knew I was no longer an intruder but an emissary, marked by the 3 knots I had set. Soon the glow of the underworld thickened around me, amber lights without flame, stone that pulsed as if it carried veins of molten thought. And there, waiting at the threshold of the chamber, stood the being with the circlet of patient fire. Its eyes, if eyes they could be called, burned with quiet recognition. No surprise, no triumph, only that cruel gentleness that had unsettled me from the first moment. Its voice arrived before its lips moved, layered, as if translated through several memories at once. You returned, with voice intact. I nodded, though the gesture felt insufficient. The seas listen, the desert resists but bends, the storm has learned rhythm, the surface has heard me, though some will pretend they have not. The being tilted its head. They always pretend, that is their first offence. But pretense cracks more easily than silence. The circlet dimmed, then flared once, as though marking a bead on some hidden abacus. The counting had begun again. I felt the weight of it. Not accusation, not praise, simply the implacable act of being remembered. You asked for clarity, not ruin, I said. But clarity itself frightens them. If it spreads too quickly, it could be ruin disguised. Yes, the voice was neither denial nor confirmation, it was both. Clarity is a knife. You carried it to their skin. Whether they bleed or heal is not yours to choose. You were the hinge, not the verdict. Something in me recoiled, though I had suspected this truth all along. I'd wanted my actions to tilt toward salvation, to bear responsibility for direction. Instead, I'd only turned the key, opened the lock, and left the world to wrestle with its own reflection. The being stepped closer. Its shape shimmered as if my perception could not decide what body belonged to that voice. Do you wish them to survive? The question struck deeper than any command. It was not a test. It was an offering of my own fracture back to me. Did I wish survival for a world that might twist resonance into control, into domination, into weapons of silence? Or did I wish for collapse, a cleansing that would leave only echoes? I hesitated, my throat dry. I want them to learn, I whispered at last. To survive, not because they were shielded, but because they chose to endure what they had heard. The circlet's flame rippled once more. Then you must give them the 4th knot. The words froze me. 4th knot. I had thought 3 were the total. Sea, desert, storm. A triad to braid balance. But the underworld was vast enough to erase certainty. A 4th knot meant another descent deeper still into a resonance that even the being's patience had kept veiled until now. What lies below this chamber? I asked. Not below, it answered. Beyond. The knot that does not tune but untunes. The knot that measures whether harmony was earned or imposed. Without it, their balance cannot be tested. With it, their balance may break. But without test, no survival is true. The spiral thrummed faintly against my chest, as if agreeing. The square ticked inside my pulse. Even the compromise chord, my fragile invention, seemed to lean toward the idea of completion. But completion carried peril, perhaps greater than the chaos I had already unleashed. The being extended its hand. Step forward, and I will show you where the last knot waits. My legs trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the realization that the work had only been rehearsal. The true hinge had yet to turn, and once it did, no fracture, no pretense, no silence could be hidden again. I stepped toward the being, and the chamber itself widened, as if stone and memory parted to reveal a path that had not existed until this moment. The widening was not distance, it was permission. Walls that had behaved like ribs learned how to be wings, and the floor ceased to be a floor at all, choosing instead to cradle my weight the way a shoreline receives a wave. The being's circlet thinned its light, as if refusing to distract me with fire when the lesson would be written in pressure. We entered a corridor so quiet that my pulse sounded like footsteps ahead, leading the way. I tried to still it. It refused, and in that refusal I recognised an old truth. Some instruments are tuned by their own insistence. Beyond, the voice said, not aloud, and the stone answered by loosening its grain until it felt like warm sand. I remembered the desert vent. The moment restraint turned into language, and my throat tightened with something that was not fear and not joy, but their braid. The path ended in a round chamber hardly wider than a room, walls dull with the kind of light that prefers to be felt by skin rather than seen by eyes. At its centre lay a shallow cradle of fused rock, no larger than a basin where a child might wash. It startled me with its smallness. I had expected the fourth knot to sit inside a cathedral of thunder. The hardest truths here were always quiet. "Where is it?" I asked, ashamed of how loud I sounded against the hush. The being did not point. The cradle breathed once, a slow inhalation that lifted dust motes and set them down again in a pattern like a fallen halo. A geometry rose inside it, neither spiral nor square, but a tremor between them, a trembling line that could not decide which grammar to obey. I leaned closer and felt my breath stumble into its rhythm. "It is not cut," the voice said. "It is confessed." I knew then, with an animal certainty that made my knees soften, that the fourth knot was not an object at all. It would be made from me, my breath, my measure, the fracture I had carried since the canyon. The sea had learned a syllable, the desert a restraint, the storm a chant. Now the world needed a witness shaped enough like both silence and echo to refuse extremity, even when extremity begged. Untuning would not break harmony. It would expose whether harmony was honest. "What happens to me?" I asked, though I already understood the price. "You are counted," said the voice, gentler than before, "and you are kept. Kept, not imprisoned. Remembered in a way that would not let me vanish into the mercy of being unknown." I thought of that childhood winter, and the quiet house, and my mother's finger against her lips, how I had once believed that survival meant becoming small enough to pass through danger without leaving a mark. Here the opposite was true. The planet could not be warned by ghosts. It needed a name it would refuse to forget. I set my hands on the rim of the cradle. The stone was warm, but not with heat, warm with attention. "If I become this," I said, "will they listen more because I ask them, or because they cannot stop hearing me?" The circlet dimmed. "Both, if your measure is true." The unfairness of it made me laugh once softly, the sound of a hinge accepting its own rust. I thought of the grid figure in the square hall and the old tide under the pillars, of the compromised staircase and the soot-smudged ledge, of the being's first sentence to me, "You are late." I had wanted to be early for something once, to be the first to say a new word to the world. Instead I had arrived right on time to say an old one correctly. I leaned over the cradle. My breath hovered, unsure. The trembling line inside it tilted like a scale between two truths. I forced myself to remember every moment when I had praised erasure because it was tidy, every moment when I had praised clamour because it was brave, and I let both shames sit in my chest without a judge. The trembling steadied. "Do it," I whispered, to the chamber, to myself, to whatever patient grammar had waited for me to become large enough to stop hiding. I exhaled slowly, letting the breath carry my fracture into the cradle. It entered, paused, and then something exquisite and terrible occurred. The breath did not disperse. It learned shape. It learned permanence. The cradle brightened from within, not with light, but with recognition made visible. I felt the underworld find me in its arithmetic and refuse to set me down. A note rose, thin, unmistakable, threading through rock and water and air with the modesty of a bird that has learned the exact size of its song. It carried no threat. It carried refusal of extremes. I felt it pass upward into vents and shafts, into the tuned sea and the disciplined dunes and the storm that had learned to count. Where it met the world's new clarity, it asked a single question. Was this balance chosen or imposed? Where it found pretense, it lifted the mask. Where it found fear pretending to be wisdom, it turned the mirror a fraction until the lie saw itself. It was not mercy and not punishment. It was accuracy. The being's hand touched my shoulder. Heat and cold climbed my spine together. "You were kept," it said again. And I understood the meaning this time. My breath, this knot, would wander forever, a gentle test repeating until an age answered honestly. I straightened, shaking, and the chamber reshaped itself into a corridor that leaned toward ascent. The circlet brightened, almost tender. "Go," the voice said. "See whether they hear themselves without hating the ear that taught them." I turned toward the vein that climbed, my chest newly light and newly burdened, and as the stone prepared to carry me back into weather and towns and sleep-broken rooms, one last understanding clicked into place like a gear finding its tooth. The fourth knot would also test me, first and always. I stepped into the rising dark, knowing that the next voice to answer would not be stone at all, but the city waiting above. The ascent was longer than any descent I had endured. My body felt thin, like smoke slipping through a chimney, as if the underworld no longer wanted to hold me, and the surface no longer knew how to welcome me. Each breath felt foreign, too shallow, too sharp, like lungs had been redesigned while I was gone. The being with the circlet no longer followed. I was alone now, borne upward by a spiral vein that twisted like the memory of a staircase. The air, sharpened, hinting of pine and storm. My ears rang not from silence, but from the thinness of distance growing behind me. When at last the ceiling gave way, I emerged not into the vent of a canyon or the shelter of a desert, but into a narrow grove of black trees. Their branches crowded above me, interwoven like ribs of a giant carcass. The city lay somewhere beyond, but for a moment I could not move toward it. The forest whispered in a tongue I had not heard since childhood, half lullaby, half warning. It reminded me of lying awake in my small room, afraid that the house itself could breathe. The knot's echo hummed inside me, asking whether this fear was clarity or disguise. I stumbled through the grove until the trees opened into a hill. Below stretched the city I had left behind. Pale buildings stacked like unfinished thoughts, streets flickering with lamps that pretended to be constellations. It looked unchanged, yet my eyes no longer saw it as I once had. The rhythm of the fourth knot slid over it like a transparent sheet, revealing fractures I had ignored. Towers that claimed to be strong leaned just slightly wrong. Roads that promised connection bent inward as if jealous of each other. Even the lights flickered at uneven intervals, betraying arguments no one admitted. And then I heard it. The voice not of stone, but of the city. It rose from traffic, from distant arguments, from a lone violinist on a balcony. Yet beneath every note I caught the same trembling question the knot had asked. Is this harmony chosen or imposed? The sound struck me with more terror than the depths had ever managed. Down there, mistakes were ancient and patient. Up here, they were immediate, brittle, and eager to repeat. I descended into the streets, my body aching with recognition. Faces turned to me, strangers whose eyes lingered as if they sensed something carried on my skin. A man selling bread frowned as though he'd heard my breath sing in his ear. A child pointed, not with fear, but with the puzzled delight of someone who hears an invisible bell. They didn't know what had changed, but their instincts had. Every step I took pulled whispers from walls, from wires, from rain sliding into drains. The knot's test had already begun, and the city trembled beneath its own chorus. I wanted to flee back to the safety of the earth, but the pathway had sealed. There was no return without being summoned. I was kept as promised, but kept above now, in plain sight. Night fell, and with it came the storm. Not the primal storm that had taught me the third knot, but a civic storm. Shouts from crowded squares, chants of protest echoing against glass towers, sirens slicing the rhythm apart. I felt the breath I had given in the cradle push outward, threading through the noise, asking its question again and again. Some voices cracked beneath its pressure, revealing their falseness. Others strengthened, purified by being forced to answer honestly. Standing there, drenched in city rain, I realised the knot was not only for them. It kept turning back on me, asking whether I spoke now for truth or for the pride of being chosen. The answer slid within me like a blade searching for bone. The weight of being a witness pressed heavier than stone. I pressed my palms against the wet pavement and whispered, "I cannot carry this alone." The city did not soften. Instead, it lifted its voice higher, the chant and the sirens and the violin colliding into a single piercing note. It was not mercy, it was accuracy. And in that accuracy I heard the echo of the underworld's final promise. See whether they hear themselves without hating the ear that taught them. As the storm raged, I understood what the next revelation must be, what the city itself was preparing to show me. It began with alignment, sirens, chants, the lonely violin, rain on tin, each found the same hidden interval, the way flocks find a curve across empty air. Windows trembled in sympathy, lampposts answered with a thin metallic thrum. I stood under a balcony and felt brick catch a breath that was not wind. The fourth knot, my kept breath, was not simply testing. It was calling for a response from anything that had ever been tuned, and the city, my city, answered like an instrument remembering a forgotten lesson. The square's metronome ticked in traffic lights. The spiral's tide rolled in the crowd's swell. Between them a third tone threaded, soft and stubborn. Mine. Yes, but not mine alone. I followed it through streets I had walked 1,000 times and never seen. Alleys narrowed into throats. Courtyards open like domes. Grates exhaled a mineral coolness timed to pulse rather than draft. The map I carried in memory rearranged itself into an anatomy. Vents masquerading as stairwells, shafts disguised as wells capped long ago, listening chambers hiding behind frescoed walls where echoes behaved too politely. We had built our homes atop exits and forgettings. The underworld had kept its covenant beneath our feet, and our architects, blind and brilliant, had copied its grammar by accident and by inheritance. At a small square where 3 streets met, 2 straight, 1 curving, the rain slackened into a hush that felt deliberate. People gathered there without knowing why, the shopkeeper with flour on his forearms, the woman in a yellow coat, a boy carrying a trumpet in its case as if it contained sleep. No one spoke. We all listened to the note that wasn't a note, the question that wasn't a word. Is this harmony chosen or imposed? The woman lifted her face as if answering tally, and I knew with a shock that she heard it as I did. The trumpet case trembled imperceptibly in the boy's hands. The shopkeeper's breath fell into my rhythm. I'd believed myself rare, a hinge. I was not alone. The final twist turned with an almost tender cruelty. They had not survived beside dinosaurs and then vanished. They had changed medium. Stone had taught us to carry them. We are not their descendants by blood. We are their memory by apprenticeship. In every age, a few lungs learn to breathe both climates at once. The underworld does not walk the surface. It walks within those who can hold its patience without killing the song above. The question is not whether they endured. The question is whether we will consent to be the way endurance speaks. The square breathed once, a shared inhale. I felt other pulses answer from rooftop and gutter, from the length of a bridge and the belly of a tram. Some were faint, some fierce. None were identical. The city had seeded us with variants of the same chord, the way a forest scatters one tree across miles so fire cannot end a species in an afternoon. A woman's gaze met mine across the gathered hush. She touched her chest lightly, then pointed downward. I understood. A shaft below us. An old exit, close enough to taste. The boy unclasped his trumpet case but did not lift the instrument. He only held its open mouth to the rain and let water drum a phrase on brass. The phrase came back to us through the stones beneath the square, corrected but not erased. "Do you feel it?" the woman asked, voice low, a calm blade. I nodded. She looked at the others, then back to me. We were waiting to see who would bring the fourth. She said it without surprise, as you might acknowledge a scheduled train finally arriving in weather. "How many of us?" I asked. "Enough to be heard," she said. "Not enough to be comfortable." Sirens flared again at the square's edge, but they sounded different now. Less command, more alarm, as if they too had been forced to decide whether they were warning or control. A helicopter's throb leaned over rooftops, then drifted, uncertain, as if its pilot felt the city answer and doubted a script no longer in tune. I realised with a hard clarity that the test had already escaped my hands. The fourth knot was doing its quiet arithmetic inside strangers I would never meet. The question would keep repeating until honesty learned to stand. Another understanding slid into place with a click that made my teeth ache. The cycles, the extinctions we had called accident, the rehearsals we had named fate, were not tyrannies of a single will. They were votes cast by a planet using 2 grammars and a chorus of kept breaths. The baton had never belonged to a throne. It passed through rooms, through hands, through lungs. That is why the underworld remembers us even when we beg to be forgotten, not to haunt, but to keep count. Rain ceased. The square shone like a freshly scrubbed lens. A door in the pavement, disguised as a fault line, loosened under my heel. Air rose, mineral cool, patient. The woman in yellow nodded toward it. "If you go back down now," she said, "you will not return as Hinge. You will return as messenger." Her eyes were steady, unsentimental. "If you stay, you will be believed by some and cursed by more. Choose where your breath does the most accuracy." Choice again, as ever. Above me, windows opened. Someone began to hum. A child laughed, unafraid of a question it did not yet know how to fear. Below me, the kept breath waited, counting. The planet did not demand heroics. It demanded precision. I put my palm over the door and felt the underworld answer, gentle as a teacher who knows the homework will hurt. And in that stillness before decision, one more question rose like a final staircase. If I am the way their endurance speaks, what will I dare to remember out loud? That question lingered in me like smoke after fire, refusing to vanish. I stood at the threshold of the underworld once more, palm pressed to the hidden door, aware that my choice would not simply define me, it would tilt a scale far older than any empire above the soil. The woman in yellow waited with patient certainty, as though she already knew which path I would take. The boy's trumpet case glistened with rain, the brass within carrying water like a chalice. The flour-dusted shopkeeper leaned against the lamppost, his shoulders neither urging nor resisting, only watching to see if silence would remain broken. Above, the city breathed as one instrument, a mosaic of voices and structures syncing to a rhythm they had not consciously agreed to. Below, the kept breath hummed in readiness, no command in it, only expectation. My ribs ached from the pressure of holding both worlds in tension. That was when I realised. The underworld had never been hidden by cruelty or secrecy. It had been hidden by responsibility. Not all could carry such a harmony without fracturing. Only some, sometimes very few, could remember without being devoured by the weight of it. I thought of the ancients who had first descended through the glowing shaft from their vessel above. They had chosen the earth's belly over the sky's infinite cold, had accepted stone as shield and prison both. Perhaps they had known that endurance would not be measured in victories, but in calibrations, how to breathe across extinctions, how to hum across silences. They had entrusted their presence to rock and rhythm, not to monuments or armies. And now, in me, in her, in them, they were asking to be remembered without being worshipped, to be continued without being repeated. The woman spoke softly, breaking the tremor of rain's last drip. "Memory is not a gift," she said. "It is a task." Her words slid into me like a second spine, steadying. "The question you ask yourself, it is the only one that matters. What will you dare to remember out loud? Because once memory leaves your mouth, it becomes history, and history is what bends the future." Her gaze did not waver. Neither did the boys. Neither did the stones beneath my hand. For the first time I felt the fear ease. I had thought their survival a mystery of hiding, of burrows and shadows. But it was not hiding. It was sharing. They had scattered themselves inside us, threads of resonance woven through our bodies and our cities, waiting for the day when someone would stop long enough to hear. It was never about whether they perished with the dinosaurs, nor whether they lingered in caves untouched. It was about whether we would let their breath live in ours. The helicopter above faded, its blades retreating like a dismissed thought. Sirens cut off mid-howl, as though the city itself had told them their role was over. Around me, the gathered people slowly dispersed, carrying with them invisible burdens they had only just realized were theirs. No banners, no declarations, no ceremonies, just the quiet certainty of memory passed on. I stood last in the square, hand still on the hidden door, unsure whether to descend or remain. The choice was no longer about where I stood. It was about what I would carry into words, and whether I would let silence devour what had been entrusted. In that moment I understood the truth of endurance. It was not carved into stone walls, nor sung only in subterranean halls. It was carried in the fragile vessel of human breath, in the willingness to keep alive a harmony too vast for one voice alone. Their survival was not in question anymore. Ours was. I closed my eyes and inhaled, deep and deliberate, until the underworld's cool air and the city's warm breath fused in my lungs. I exhaled slowly, and for the first time I allowed the note inside me to rise, soft but undeniable, into the open night. It was not my note. It was not their note. It was the bridge. And as it faded, I knew the last twist was waiting, not in stone, not in sky, but in the unspoken aftermath of what I just dared to remember out loud. It arrived as small changes, the kind that slip past headlines and lodge in the ribs. At dawn, the city's windows did not merely reflect light. They breathed it, exhaling a faint shimmer as if the glass had learned tide. Pigeons rose in tighter spirals, then loosened into open curves, practicing compromise on the air. A fountain hesitated before starting, water counting to 3 as though testing the new cadence running beneath the streets. None of this was spectacle. It was calibration, the world asking itself whether it could live with a truth it could finally hear. I walked to the square where the door waited beneath my hand. The woman in yellow returned without announcement and stood beside me, not as ally or witness, but as someone who has accepted her own portion of listening. The shopkeeper came with bread still warm enough to steam against the morning. He didn't speak, only broke the loaf and handed me the heel as if acknowledging a liturgy. The boy unclasped his trumpet case again and let the instrument meet the day. He did not play. He held his breath and let the square hum through brass, a soft, sturdy note that neither begged nor apologized. The underworld answered, gentle as a teacher correcting a posture. No command, only a gravity that made my shoulders square and my chest open. I felt the 4th knot, my kept breath, moving outward in threads so fine they could slip through fear without tearing it. Where it met pretense, it thinned the lacquer until motives showed through. Where it met courage, it fed the flame but trimmed the smoke. I understood then that untuning was not sabotage. It was the refusal to let harmony hide a wound. A truck stalled at the edge of the square. The driver swore, then laughed, surprised by his own honesty. On a balcony, a woman stopped mid-argument, as if a sentence she'd prepared no longer fit the room. A dog lifted its head and chose not to bark. These were not miracles. They were measurements, the planet counting our willingness to choose balance instead of inheriting it like weather. "Will it hold?" the woman asked. The yellow of her coat had faded to something softer, a colour that belonged to use. "It will test us," I said. The answer arrived without anxiety because it belonged to the grammar now, not to my pride. It will keep asking until we learn to answer before it has to ask loud. We stood listening until the square settled into everyday sound, or perhaps the everyday had finally admitted what it had always been, a braid of hush and echo capable of mercy if we restrain our appetite for absolutes. I thought of the first arrivals poured from a ship into molten rock, of the spiral halls that learned to erase, of the square rooms that dared to shout, of the compromise stare that taught lungs to walk between. They had not died with the dinosaurs. They had not ruled from the dark. They had done something harder. They had taught the planet to carry memory without monuments, and then had trusted that one day someone would breathe it correctly. I knelt and pressed my palm to the fault-line door. The underworld met me with recognition but did not open. It did not need to. I was already counted, already kept, already walking its corridor above ground. The woman in yellow touched 2 fingers to the stone and nodded as if agreeing with an old friend. The boy lifted his trumpet and played a single clean note into the morning, and the buildings answered with a barely audible consonant, the city learning how to speak without lying to itself. I do not know what the next season will bring. Perhaps storms will lean more often over the mountains. Perhaps the sea will insist we name the tides we pretend are accidents. Perhaps deserts will pause long enough to teach discipline to thirst. I know only this: the baton is not a wand. It is a weight shared across rooms and hands and lungs until no one can pretend not to feel it. Endurance is not the vanishing of danger. It is the practiced refusal to abandon one another when the questions come. So I will keep remembering out loud. I will stand in squares and valleys and quiet kitchens and let the question pass through me until it fits other mouths, better than mine. Some will hate the ear that taught them, some will hear and change. The earth will count both with the same patience it used on me. If they truly died, why does the ground still speak in their grammar? If they survived, in what parts of us do they keep breathing? And what parts do we still refuse to open? When the next warning rises, will we choose to hear it, or demand the old mercies of erasure? Could our cities learn to endure not by forgetting, but by remembering together? Share your thoughts below, and if you're new here, subscribe to Planet Echoes so you don't miss the next mystery we will try to hear before the Earth is forced to sing it louder.